Somewhere right now, a team of archaeologists is staring at an artifact that doesn't fit. The dates are wrong. The location makes no sense. And the explanation, the official one, quietly gets filed away. History as we know it has borders, and just beyond them sit dozens of events, places, and disappearances that even the most respected researchers can't account for. We've gathered 3 hours of them. Not myths, not folklore. Real historical records with real gaps that nobody has closed. So get comfortable, because we're about to walk straight into those gaps together. Picture the Sahara Desert, not as a postcard, but as a living force, an ocean of sand that breathes, shifts, and swallows, dunes that rise and fall like slow tides over centuries, temperatures that crack stone, winds that carry the weight of an entire horizon. It is one of the most hostile environments on Earth, and it keeps its secrets with extraordinary discipline. It is here, somewhere beneath this vast, indifferent expanse, that one of antiquity's most baffling military disappearances may still lie waiting. The year is 525 BC. Cambyses II, king of Persia and son of the great Cyrus, has just conquered Egypt. His army has swept through the ancient world with ruthless efficiency. Flush with victory and ambition, he sets his sights on the Siwa Oasis, a remote sanctuary deep in the Libyan desert, home to the Oracle of Amun. Whether out of religious contempt, political calculation, or the particular arrogance of conquerors, Cambyses dispatches an army to destroy the oracle and bring the oasis under Persian control. By most ancient accounts, that army numbered 50,000 soldiers. They marched west from Thebes. They entered the desert, and then they were gone. The Greek historian Herodotus, writing roughly a century after the event, is our primary source. He records that the army reached a place called the Islands of the Blessed, somewhere between the Nile and Siwa, and was consumed by a catastrophic sandstorm. In his telling, the winds came suddenly, violently, burying everything and everyone beneath the desert floor. No survivors returned, no messengers, no explanation ever reached the Persian court beyond the storm itself. For more than 2,000 years, that has been the story. A sandstorm, a tragedy, a footnote. But here is where the account begins to strain. 50,000 men is not a small patrol. It is a city on the march. Soldiers, scouts, supply lines, animals, equipment. Even under catastrophic conditions, something almost always survives. Something washes back. A remnant. A deserter. A piece of armor carried by wind to a caravan route. The silence following this army's disappearance is not just unusual. It is, by almost any military or archaeological standard, extraordinary. Expeditions searching for the lost army began as early as the 19th century. Explorers probed the western desert with increasingly sophisticated tools. Nothing of substance emerged. No mass burial site, no scattered weapons cache, no bones. Then, in 2009, 2 Italian archaeologists, Angelo and Alfredo Castiglioni, announced they had found fragments of human bones, bronze weapons, and horse remains in a remote area of the Egyptian desert near the Siwa Road. The find generated significant excitement. Some researchers believed it represented the first physical trace of Cambyses' army. Egyptian authorities, however, were skeptical. The sample size was small. The dating was inconclusive. The debate has not been resolved. Other theories have surfaced over the years. Some scholars question whether the army ever actually departed, suggesting the story of its destruction may have been a face-saving invention, a narrative constructed to explain a campaign that was simply abandoned. Others point to the oral traditions of desert communities who speak of ancient bones surfacing during particularly powerful storms, as though the desert occasionally chooses to reveal what it has taken. What is certain is this: if 50,000 soldiers truly entered that desert and never returned, their remains are somewhere beneath the sand. Preserved perhaps in near-perfect condition by the same dry heat that has kept pharaohs intact for millennia. The desert did not forget them. So why haven't we found them? Before moving to the next mystery. If you love deep dives into mysteries like this, I put together an entire ebook dedicated to the hidden secrets of ancient Egypt. The Egypt they don't cover in school, don't show in museums, and don't explain in mainstream documentaries. The link is right below this video. Now, let's get into the next mystery. Apologies for that. Here it is with the same structure. No section title header, no bold chapter labels, just clean flowing prose with paragraph gaps and no dividing lines. The desert is not the only place that swallows the truth. Sometimes it happens in broad daylight, on a royal road, in the heart of a diplomatic mission, and the world still cannot agree on what occurred. We move now from the silence of the Sahara to the courts and corridors of the ancient Near East, to a moment in history so strange, so politically charged, that even the people who lived through it seemed uncertain what to believe. This is the story of a prince who never arrived, and a queen who may have paid for asking. Egypt, circa 1323 BC. The court is in crisis. Tutankhamun, the boy king, is dead. He has left behind no male heir, no clear line of succession, and a kingdom that powerful men are already quietly maneuvering to control. Into this vacuum steps a woman, Ankhesenamun, his young widow. A queen with no husband, no son, and no protection beyond the walls of her own palace. What she does next has no parallel in the ancient world. She writes a letter. Not to an Egyptian noble, not to a priest, not to a general. She writes to Suppiluliuma I, the king of the Hittites, the most powerful ruler in the known world outside of Egypt itself. And what she asks him for is almost impossible to comprehend by the standards of the age. She asks for one of his sons. The letter, preserved in Hittite archives and known today as the Deeds of Suppiluliuma, is extraordinary in its directness. Ankhesenamun writes that she has no son, that she will not take a servant as her husband, and that she is afraid. She asks the Hittite king to send a prince to Egypt, to marry her, and to become pharaoh. For a moment, consider what this request meant. Egypt and the Hittites had been rivals, occasionally enemies, for generations. For an Egyptian queen to reach across that border and offer the throne of Egypt to a foreign prince was not merely unconventional. It was, by every political and cultural standard of the time, unthinkable. Suppiluliuma himself could barely believe it. He delayed. He sent envoys to verify the letter was genuine. Ankhesenamun wrote again, more urgently this time, insisting she was not deceiving him, that her need was real, and that she was running out of time. He believed her. He sent his son. That son's name was Zannanza, and somewhere between the Hittite capital of Hattusa and the Egyptian border, he died. The Hittite records are blunt about the fact of his death. They offer almost no detail about how it happened. The cause is not recorded. The location is not specified. No Egyptian source acknowledges the event at all, which is itself a form of statement. When an entire royal court decides not to mention something, that silence is not accidental. Suppiluliuma was devastated and furious. He wrote to the new Egyptian pharaoh. By this point, it appears to have been I, the elderly official who had moved quickly to marry Ankhesenamun and claim the throne, demanding to know what had happened to his son. The Egyptians denied responsibility. The Hittite king did not accept that answer. Within a short time, war broke out between the two empires, a conflict that some historians trace directly back to the death of Zannanza. So what actually happened on that road? The most straightforward interpretation is assassination. Zannanza was traveling to take the Egyptian throne, a prospect that would have been deeply threatening to anyone already positioned to claim it. I, in particular, had both the motive and the means. As a senior court official with decades of influence, he had the networks, the authority, and the urgency. A Hittite prince on his way to become pharaoh would have ended A's ambitions entirely. Others have pointed toward the military. Egypt's army, led by the general Horemheb, was another power center in the court. Horemheb had his own designs on the throne. He would eventually claim it himself, after A's brief reign. A foreign king backed by Hittite military power would have threatened the army's influence as much as anyone else's. The road to Egypt passed through territory where Egyptian soldiers operated freely. An interception would not have been difficult to arrange. There are also those who raise a quieter possibility, that Zannanza never made it out of Hittite territory at all, that the danger did not come from Egypt, but from within. A prince departing for a foreign throne leaves behind rivals and factions of his own. Hittite succession was rarely peaceful. The idea that Zannanza was removed before he could even cross the border has never been entirely dismissed, even if it remains a minority view. And then there is Ankhesenamun herself. She disappears from the historical record almost immediately after this. No further letters, no inscriptions. Her name is erased from certain monuments, a common punishment in ancient Egypt, reserved for those who had fallen catastrophically from favor. Whatever she had hoped for, whatever desperate plan she had set in motion, it did not protect her. She had reached across the ancient world asking for help, and the man she asked for never arrived. We have the letter. We have the grief of a Hittite king. We have the silence of an Egyptian court and the erasure of a queen. What we do not have is a body, a location, a confession, or a name. Zannanza died somewhere, at someone's instruction, or by someone's hand. After more than 3,000 years, we are still not sure whose. Some mysteries are written in silence. Others are written in water. We have followed a prince into the desert and watched a queen disappear from history without a trace. Now we travel west, to the coast of ancient Greece, to a city that was thriving one evening and gone by morning. Not conquered, not abandoned, not burned to the ground by an invading army. Simply gone, swallowed by the earth and the sea in a single night. The Greeks who survived it never forgot. And for centuries after, sailors claimed they could see it, shimmering beneath the surface of the water, columns still standing, streets still laid out in their familiar grid, as though the city had simply been pressed downward into another world. Whether that was memory or myth, what happened to Helike remains one of the most dramatic and least understood catastrophes of the ancient world. Imagine the Gulf of Corinth on an ordinary winter evening in 373 BC. The water is calm. The city of Helike sits comfortably on the southern shore, prosperous, respected, a significant religious center dedicated to the god Poseidon. It is not a minor settlement. Helike is the head of the Achaean League, a confederation of Greek city-states. It has history, influence, and permanence. People have lived here for generations. There is no reason to believe tonight will be different from any other. Then the animals begin to move. Ancient sources record something that modern seismologists find genuinely interesting. In the days before the disaster, the creatures of Helike behaved strangely. Rats, snakes, weasels, centipedes, all of them reportedly fled the city in large numbers, moving inland away from the coast. The people of Helike noticed. They did not know what it meant. They stayed. What followed, according to the historian Diodorus Siculus and others, was a catastrophic earthquake followed immediately by a massive tsunami. The ground shook, the sea surged, and Helike, the entire city, was submerged. A Spartan fleet anchored nearby was dragged under with it. 2,000 soldiers sent to help in the aftermath could not recover a single body. The water had taken everything. The ancient sources agree on the broad outline. What they cannot fully explain is the scale and completeness of the destruction. Cities survive earthquakes. They survive floods. Populations scatter, rebuild, return. But Helike did not get that opportunity. The submersion appears to have been total and immediate, the kind of geological event that doesn't just damage a place, but erases it. Pausanias, writing centuries later, noted that the ruins were still visible beneath the water in his time. Sailors used them as navigational landmarks. The city had become its own monument to whatever force had claimed it. For nearly 2,000 years, Helike stayed lost. Its exact location was unknown. Medieval and early modern scholars treated it somewhat as they treated Atlantis. A cautionary tale, a symbol of divine punishment, a warning wrapped in geography. The comparison to Atlantis is one that researchers have deliberately tried to set aside because it tends to pull the conversation toward mythology and away from archaeology. Helike was real. The ancient sources are consistent, detailed, and numerous. This was not a legend. It was a city. The search for its physical remains began seriously in the 20th century and yielded results that were both exciting and complicated. In the 1980s and 1990s, archaeologists began surveying the coastal plain near the modern village of Rizomylos in the northern Peloponnese. What they found, buried beneath meters of sediment and lagoon deposits, were the remains of a classical Greek settlement: pottery, walls, artifacts, dating to the right period. The site was inland, not underwater, which immediately raised questions. Had the coastline changed that dramatically in 2,000 years? Had the earthquake and tsunami not submerged the city in open water, but rather buried it beneath sediment as the landscape was violently rearranged? The geological record in the region shows evidence of significant liquefaction, a process where saturated soil essentially behaves like liquid during seismic activity, causing structures to sink rapidly into the ground rather than toppling in the conventional sense. This may explain the completeness of the destruction. Not a wave that washed over the city, but the ground itself giving way. The city sinking into its own foundation while water rushed in behind. But there are details that resist even this explanation. The ancient accounts describe the submersion as happening at night, during winter, with extraordinary speed. They describe the waters closing over the city so quickly that rescue was impossible. Some sources mention unusual lights seen in the sky beforehand, atmospheric phenomena that certain researchers have connected to earthquake precursors, electrical activity generated by tectonic stress in the rock. Others have noted that the timing, winter, darkness, a religious festival period, may have meant that the population was gathered in particular places, which could explain why the death toll was so complete. There is also the matter of Poseidon. Helike was his city, his sanctuary. Ancient writers did not hesitate to interpret the disaster as divine punishment, the god of the sea and earthquakes reclaiming what was his. The specific transgression cited in some sources was the city's refusal to give a sacred statue to Greek colonists in Asia Minor. Whether that detail is historical or constructed after the fact to make sense of the senseless, we cannot say. What we can say is that a major functioning Greek city was destroyed so completely in a single night that 2,000 trained soldiers could not find a single survivor the following morning. The excavations continue. The sediment is deep. The landscape has shifted so dramatically over the centuries that matching ancient descriptions to modern geography remains genuinely difficult. Somewhere beneath the coastal plain of the northern Peloponnese, Helike is still there, waiting, perhaps, for someone to finally ask the right questions of the ground. Some disappearances happen in an instant: a wave, a tremor, a single catastrophic night. Others are slower, quieter. A city doesn't collapse so much as it exhales, gradually and without explanation, until one day the streets are empty and the fires have gone cold. We have watched the earth swallow Helike whole. Now we cross an ocean and move forward in time, to the heart of North America, to a civilization that most people have never heard of, despite the fact that at its peak it was one of the largest cities in the world. No earthquake took this one. No tsunami. No invading army left its mark in the archaeological record. It simply ended. And nobody is entirely sure why. Stand at the base of Monk's Mound in present-day Illinois, just east of St. Louis, and look up. The structure rising before you is not a natural hill. It is a hand-built earthen platform, 100 feet tall, covering 14 acres at its base, constructed entirely without metal tools, without the wheel, and without any written instructions we have ever found. It is larger at its base than the Great Pyramid of Giza. It took generations of labor to build, and it sits at the center of what was once the most sophisticated urban civilization north of Mexico. This was Cahokia. At its height, somewhere between 1050 and 1100 AD, Cahokia was home to an estimated 10 to 20,000 people. Some scholars place the figure even higher when surrounding settlements are included. That would have made it comparable in size to London at the same period in history. It had neighborhoods, marketplaces, a central plaza large enough to hold the entire population at once, and a sophisticated system of wooden posts arranged in precise circles that archaeologists call Woodhenge. A solar calendar aligned with sunrise on the solstices and equinoxes, suggesting a society with a deep investment in astronomical observation. It was, by any reasonable measure, a city. Complex, organized, and thriving. By 1400 AD, it was empty. The people of Cahokia left no written language. They left no account of what happened, no inscriptions, no oral tradition that has been definitively connected to their departure. What they left behind were the mounds, the artifacts, the post holes, and the questions. Archaeologists have worked this site seriously since the mid-20th century, and the picture that has emerged is both clearer and more confusing than early researchers expected. The evidence points not to a single cause, but to a convergence, a slow accumulation of pressures that may have made the city impossible to sustain. The most widely supported explanation centers on environmental strain. Cahokia's population growth was rapid and intense. Feeding that many people required clearing enormous areas of forest for agriculture, which in turn destabilized the surrounding landscape. Soil erosion, flooding, and declining crop yields appear in the geological record as the city grew. Some researchers believe the agricultural system simply could not keep pace with the population that depended on it. Climate adds another layer. The period between roughly 1150 and 1350 AD saw significant climatic instability across North America, a shift sometimes referred to as the medieval warm period transitioning into cooler, less predictable conditions. Droughts became more frequent. The floodplain that had made Cahokia's location so agriculturally productive became less reliable. For a city of this size, even modest disruptions to the food supply would have had serious consequences. There is also evidence of social tension that goes beyond food scarcity. Excavations at a site called Mound 72 revealed something deeply unsettling. Mass graves containing the remains of hundreds of individuals, many of them young women, arranged in ways that strongly suggest ritual sacrifice. Nearby burials of high-status individuals, laid on elaborate ceremonial platforms of shell beads, paint a picture of a society with extreme hierarchies and practices that may have generated significant internal resistance over time. Some researchers believe Cahokia's political structure was, in essence, a form of coercive theocracy, a system where elite religious and political authority demanded tribute, labor, and possibly lives from the broader population. That kind of system can sustain itself during periods of abundance. During scarcity, it tends to fracture. Evidence of a large wooden stockade, a defensive wall built around the central precinct sometime in the 1100s, suggests that by a certain point, Cahokia's leaders felt the need to physically separate themselves from the population outside. Whether that wall was built against external threats or internal ones, nobody can say with certainty. But walls of that kind are rarely built in peaceful times. The fringe interpretations, as always, exist at the edges of the conversation. Some researchers who study regional oral traditions among later Native American peoples believe that distant cultural memories of Cahokia survive, encoded not as history, but as story, as warning, as the kind of knowledge that travels across generations in forms that academic archaeology has difficulty recognizing or verifying. Whether any of those threads connect meaningfully to what happened here remains genuinely open. What the mainstream and the speculative share in this case is a common uncertainty. The evidence suggests multiple overlapping causes. It does not point cleanly at any one of them. A city of 20,000 people does not vanish without reason. Somewhere in the relationship between Cahokia's ambition and its environment, between its hierarchies and its hungry population, between its astronomical sophistication and its apparent inability to see what was coming, the answer exists. Monk's Mound still stands. The plaza is still there beneath the grass. The post holes of Woodhenge are still mapped in the earth, marking sunrises that nobody has watched from this spot in 600 years. Whatever drove the people of Cahokia away, they never came back. and the mounds have been waiting ever since for someone to fully explain why. Cahokia was not alone in its silence. Across the same continent, separated by roughly 1,000 miles and a few decades of history, another sophisticated civilization was quietly dismantling itself, not collapsing under the weight of catastrophe, not fleeing a sudden threat, but withdrawing, deliberately, methodically, as though a decision had been made at some level of collective understanding that it was time to leave. The mounds of Illinois give way in our journey to the canyon walls of New Mexico. The Mississippi floodplain becomes high desert. The scale shifts from an urban center to something that looks, at first glance, more like a remote outpost, until you examine it more closely and realize that what was built here, in one of the least hospitable landscapes in North America, should not exist at all. Stand at the edge of Chaco Canyon on a clear morning and let the place settle over you. The canyon cuts through the Colorado Plateau like an old scar, wide, flat-bottomed, ringed by sandstone cliffs that glow amber and rust in the early light. The air is dry. The wind moves through without apology. There's almost no surface water. Summer temperatures climb past 100 degrees. Winter nights drop below freezing. The growing season is short and unreliable, and the soil, where it exists at all, is not generous. And yet, between roughly 850 and 1150 AD, the people we now call the ancestral Puebloans built here something extraordinary. Pueblo Bonito, the largest of Chaco's great houses, contained over 600 rooms and rose 4 stories in places. It was constructed with a precision that still draws architectural attention today. Walls aligned to solar and lunar cycles, doorways positioned to frame specific astronomical events, the entire complex oriented with an intentionality that goes far beyond basic shelter. Across the canyon and its surrounding region, at least a dozen other great houses were built to similarly exacting standards, all connected by a network of roads. Straight, wide, carefully engineered roads that extend for hundreds of miles across the desert in directions that do not always correspond to any obvious destination. Roads to nowhere, some researchers have called them, though that assessment may say more about our assumptions than about Chaco's intentions. At its height, the Chaco system functioned as something, though exactly what remains genuinely debated. A religious center, a redistribution hub, a place of pilgrimage. The great houses may not have been residential in the conventional sense at all. Some archaeologists believe they were used periodically for gatherings and ceremonies, rather than housing a permanent large population. The evidence for daily domestic life is thinner than the scale of the architecture would suggest. What is not debated is that by around 1150 AD, construction had stopped. By 1200 AD, the canyon appears to have been largely abandoned. The people who built Pueblo Bonito and aligned its walls to the movements of the moon simply walked away from it. The most rigorously supported explanation begins with drought. Tree ring records from the region, among the most detailed climate proxies available for this period, show a severe and prolonged drought beginning around 1130 AD. In a landscape already operating at the edge of what could sustain human habitation, a multi-decade dry period would have been devastating. Agricultural systems that depended on careful water management and the careful reading of seasonal patterns would have begun to fail. A center that relied on surplus and redistribution cannot function without surplus. Deforestation compounds the picture. The construction of the great houses required timber, enormous quantities of it, hauled from mountain ranges more than 60 miles away. The canyon itself had long since been stripped of usable wood. The ecological cost of Chaco's ambition was written into the landscape before the drought even arrived. But drought and deforestation, compelling as they are, do not fully account for the specific character of the abandonment. The exodus from Chaco Canyon appears to have been organized. Deliberate. Items of clear ceremonial and practical value were removed. The great houses were not simply left as they stood. Certain spaces were carefully closed, sealed, treated in ways that suggest intention rather than panic. This was not a population fleeing in the night. This was a people making a considered departure, which raises a question that the ecological explanations alone cannot answer. Where did the decision come from? Who made it? And what did Chaco represent to the people who left it behind? So significant that its closing required ceremony, yet so finished that no one returned to reclaim it. Some researchers who have worked closely with the descendant communities of the ancestral Puebloans, the Hopi, the Zuni, the various Pueblo peoples of the Rio Grande, suggest that oral traditions carry fragmented memories of Chaco's end. These traditions speak in various forms of a place that became spiritually compromised, of leadership that grew corrupt or extractive, of a center that had lost its proper relationship with the land and with the people who sustained it. These are not accounts that archaeology can confirm or deny, but they are not easily dismissed either, particularly when the material evidence itself suggests a society under significant internal strain. Evidence of violence exists at certain Chaco-era sites, skeletal remains showing signs of trauma, deposits interpreted by some researchers as evidence of coercive practices by a ruling class that controlled access to food, water, and ceremony. The roads that radiate outward from Chaco may have been as much about consolidating power as about facilitating exchange. A civilization built on a foundation that narrow, environmental, political, spiritual, may not need a single catastrophic cause to end. It may simply reach a point where continuation requires more than what remains. The canyon sits largely empty today. The great houses are managed as a national historical park. Tourists walk the same ground where Pueblo Bonito once hummed with whatever purpose its builders intended. The roads still extend outward into the desert in their straight, determined lines. And the question of where exactly they were always meant to lead remains unanswered. The roads of Chaco extend outward into silence. And that silence, it turns out, is a language that civilizations across the ancient world all seem to have spoken at one point or another. We have moved through desert canyons and river floodplains, through the collapsing centers of complex societies that left behind monuments but no explanations. Now we travel further north, dramatically further, to one of the most unforgiving edges of the inhabited world. To a place where the growing season lasts weeks rather than months, where the sea freezes and the darkness in winter is nearly total, and where a community of Norse settlers carved out an existence so improbable that their presence there still seems faintly difficult to believe. They survived for centuries in that place. And then, like the others, they were gone. Stand on the southwestern coast of Greenland in early autumn, and you will understand immediately why this land demanded everything from the people who chose to live on it. The terrain is raw and spare. Low scrub vegetation, exposed rock, fjords cutting deep into the interior where the ice sheet begins its slow, permanent dominance of the island. The wind comes off the water with weight behind it. The light, even in the good months, has a quality of borrowed time. This was the Western Settlement. Established by Norse colonists around 985 AD, following Eric the Red's initial colonization of Greenland's southern coast, it sat further north and further inland than the Eastern Settlement, more isolated, more exposed, operating always at the narrower margin between sustainability and failure. At its peak, the Western Settlement housed perhaps 500 people across a scattering of farms. They raised cattle and sheep, hunted caribou and seal, fished the fjords, and maintained enough of a connection to the broader Norse world to trade, receive occasional ships, and sustain a Christian church that was, by any measure, extraordinarily far from Rome. They were not people who frightened easily. Norse settlement of Greenland was itself an act of extraordinary determination. These were communities that had already left Norway and Iceland behind, pushing further into the unknown with each generation. The Western Settlement was the frontier of the frontier. And yet sometime around 1350 AD, it ended. The priest Ivar Bårdsson, sent from the Eastern Settlement to investigate why ships were receiving no response from the Western Settlement, arrived to find the farms intact and empty. The livestock were still there, cattle and sheep still alive, still grazing. The buildings were standing. There was no sign of violence, no evidence of fire or destruction, no bodies, no note, no indication of where the people had gone or why. just absence, complete, unexplained, and absolute. Bordson's account is one of the most quietly disturbing documents from the medieval Norse world. He reports what he found with the flat precision of a man trying to make sense of something that resists sense. He took the surviving livestock back to the eastern settlement and left the farms behind. Nobody went back. The climate explanation is the one most frequently cited, and it carries genuine weight. The period from roughly 1300 AD onward marks the beginning of what climatologists call the Little Ice Age, a prolonged cooling of temperatures across the North Atlantic that compressed growing seasons, thickened sea ice, and made the already difficult business of farming in Greenland significantly harder. For the Western settlement, already operating at the edge of what the land could support, even modest temperature drops would have had serious consequences. Crops that had barely grown before would fail entirely. Animals that had survived previous winters would not survive colder ones. But climate alone struggles to account for the specific character of what Bordson found. A community abandoning its home due to deteriorating conditions does not simply vanish. People gather what they can carry. They slaughter the animals they cannot take. They leave evidence of a decision being made. Packed belongings, emptied storage rooms, the particular archaeology of departure. The Western settlement showed none of that. The animals were alive and untended. The farms appeared functional. Whatever happened, it happened in a way that left the physical environment almost entirely undisturbed. This has led some researchers toward a more violent interpretation. The Inuit people, the Thule culture, were expanding southward along Greenland's coast during exactly this period, and their relationship with the Norse settlers was complex and not always peaceful. Norse sagas reference conflicts. Archaeological sites show evidence of cultural contact that ranges from trade to tension. Some historians believe the Western settlement's population was killed or driven off by Inuit raids, and that Bordson's account of finding only livestock reflects a settlement cleared of its people by force, with the Norse simply choosing not to record a defeat that humiliated them. Others push back on this. The Thule were not, by the archaeological record, a people given to the kind of organized mass violence that would be required to erase 500 settlers without leaving physical evidence of conflict. The relationship between the two cultures remains poorly understood, and projecting aggression onto it without clear evidence is a step many researchers are reluctant to take. A third possibility sits quietly alongside the others: that the settlers left voluntarily, choosing to abandon the Western settlement for the Eastern settlement, or, more provocatively, for somewhere else entirely. Theories about Norse settlers integrating into Inuit communities, or even striking further west toward North America, have circulated among researchers for decades. There is limited but genuinely intriguing genetic and archaeological evidence suggesting contact and possibly intermingling between Norse and indigenous North American populations in this period. None of it is conclusive. All of it is suggestive. The farms of the Western settlement are still there beneath the Greenlandic soil. The foundations of the church where those isolated colonists marked their Sundays and their dead can still be traced in the ground. Somewhere between climate and conflict and choice, 500 people made a decision or had one made for them. And in nearly 700 years, no one has been able to say with certainty which it was. There is a particular kind of loss that history reserves for things that were almost too large to disappear. The Western settlement vanished quietly, incrementally, in the cold margins of the world where few were watching. What we turn to now vanished differently, loudly, officially, by deliberate decree. And the mystery is not where it went, but what it might have found before it was ordered home and forgotten. This is the story of the greatest fleet the ancient world ever assembled. A fleet so vast, so technologically advanced, so far ahead of anything else sailing the world's oceans at the time, that its sudden and total erasure from Chinese imperial policy remains one of the most debated decisions in the history of human exploration. Picture the harbor at Nanjing in the early 15th century. The Yangtze River wide and brown and busy, and at its edge, something that defies easy description. Ships. Not the modest vessels of contemporary European exploration, Not the kind of craft Columbus would sail across the Atlantic 7 decades later, but enormous, multi-decked wooden ships that Chinese records describe as being over 400 feet long. Ships with 9 masts. Ships large enough to carry horses, fresh water gardens, and hundreds of soldiers, diplomats, and traders in something approaching comfort. These were the treasure ships of Admiral Zheng He. Between 1405 and 1433 AD, Zheng He led 7 voyages across the Indian Ocean on behalf of the Yongle Emperor and his successors. The fleet he commanded numbered, at various points, over 200 vessels and nearly 30,000 men. It visited Southeast Asia, India, the Persian Gulf, and the eastern coast of Africa, arriving at each destination not to conquer, but to project the power and prestige of the Ming dynasty, to collect tribute, to establish trade relationships, and to bring back the extraordinary: giraffes from Africa, exotic spices from Java, ambassadors for more than 30 kingdoms. The voyages were, by any measure, a demonstration of what China could do when it chose to engage with the world. And then, in 1433, following the death of Zheng He on or near his final voyage, China chose to stop. What followed was not merely a suspension of exploration. It was an erasure. The Yongle Emperor had already died in 1424, and the court officials who had opposed the voyages, Confucian scholars who viewed maritime expansion as wasteful, destabilizing, and philosophically incompatible with proper imperial governance, had been gaining influence ever since. After 1433, they moved decisively. The treasure fleet was allowed to rot at anchor. Shipbuilding of large ocean-going vessels was banned. The records of the voyages, the logs, the maps, the detailed accounts of what Zheng He's fleet had seen and documented, were, according to multiple historical accounts, deliberately destroyed. One official is said to have burned the sailing records specifically to prevent future emperors from being tempted to resume the voyages. The mainstream historical explanation for this reversal centers on internal politics and Confucian ideology. The voyages were expensive. They benefited the emperor's prestige more than the empire's economy, in the view of the scholar bureaucrats who ran the imperial administration. The Yongle Emperor had been an unusually expansionist ruler, and his successors were more inward-looking. The political winds simply shifted, and the fleet became a casualty of court ideology. That explanation is coherent and well-supported, but it sits alongside a question that refuses to stay quiet. What did Zheng He's fleet actually find? The records that survived him in survival appears to have been partly accidental, partly the result of deliberate concealment by individuals who recognized what was being lost, describe coastlines, peoples, and geographic features in terms that have generated significant controversy. A map associated with a Ming-era cartographer named Mo Yi Tong, and allegedly copied from charts that date to Zheng He's voyages, appears to show coastlines that European explorers would not officially reach for another half-century or more. The authenticity of this map is disputed, seriously disputed, and mainstream cartographic historians treat it with considerable skepticism. But the dispute itself is revealing. The question of what Zheng He's navigators knew and when they knew it has not been resolved. The destruction of the primary records means that the absence of evidence cannot be cleanly interpreted as evidence of absence. Some researchers, working at the more speculative edge of the field, have proposed that the treasure fleet reached the Americas before Columbus. The theory, advanced most publicly by the British author Gavin Menzies in his book 1421, generated enormous popular attention and nearly uniform rejection from professional historians. The evidentiary standards Menzies applied were widely criticized, but even scholars who dismiss his specific conclusions acknowledge that the gaps in the surviving record make absolute certainty in either direction difficult to achieve. What is not speculative is the scale of what was lost. A navigational tradition of 30 years, accumulated across 7 voyages covering tens of thousands of miles, carried in the minds of 30,000 sailors and encoded in charts that no longer exist, simply ended. The ships rotted. The knowledge dispersed or died with the people who held it. When European explorers began probing the Indian Ocean decades later, they encountered a maritime world that sometimes showed traces of prior contact, port cities, trade networks, cultural artifacts that pointed towards something that had come before them and left no complete record behind. Zheng He's tomb is in Nanjing. Whether his body is actually in it remains uncertain. He likely died at sea, and what was buried may have been symbolic. A memorial to a man whose greatest journeys were then officially unmemorialized. The ocean he crossed 7 times keeps its own records, written in currents and depths that no imperial decree could reach. What his fleet saw, and what was then deliberately forgotten, that question has not yet found its final answer. Deliberate forgetting is its own kind of mystery. The Chinese court erased its greatest fleet not through catastrophe, but through choice. Ink crossed out, records burned, ships left to splinter at their moorings. What we turned to now was erased differently, not by bureaucrats with ideological objections, but by the grinding weight of war, religious upheaval, and a regional power struggle that rewrote the map of an entire peninsula. And yet, for all the violence that surrounded its end, the kingdom of Himyar remained strangely absent from the popular imagination, a civilization that controlled one of the most strategically vital corners of the ancient world for centuries, and whose collapse sent ripples outward that are still, in ways most people never consider, shaping the world we live in today. We travel now to the southwestern tip of the Arabian Peninsula, to the region the ancient world called Arabia Felix, Happy Arabia, a name that referred not to any particular contentment of its people, but to the extraordinary fertility and wealth of a land that stood in sharp contrast to the desert that surrounded it. This was Yemen, and 2,000 years ago, it was one of the richest places on Earth. The highlands of southwestern Arabia capture moisture from the Indian Ocean in ways that the rest of the peninsula does not. Terraced hillsides green with agriculture, elaborate irrigation systems carved into mountain slopes, cities that served as the terminus of trade routes connecting the Mediterranean world to India, East Africa, and the spice-producing regions of the Far East. Frankincense and myrrh passed through these ports. So did silk, ivory, and gold. The kingdoms that controlled this geography did not merely survive. They accumulated. Himyar was the last and most powerful of those kingdoms. Rising to dominance around 110 BC, the Himyarites gradually absorbed their rivals, the Sabaeans, the Katabanians, the Hadrami, until by the late 3rd century AD, they controlled most of what is now Yemen. Their capital, Zafar, sat in the highlands at an elevation of nearly 10,000 feet, a city of stone palaces and temples that received ambassadors from Rome, Persia, Ethiopia, and India. Their kings bore the title King of Saba and Duraidan and Hadramaut and Yamnat, a title so long it was essentially a map of everything they had conquered. They were, by the standards of the ancient world, a major power. What makes Himyar particularly unusual, and particularly relevant to the larger currents of history, is its religious trajectory. Sometime in the 3rd or 4th century AD, the Himyarite ruling class abandoned the traditional polytheistic religion of Arabia and converted to a form of monotheism. The precise nature of that monotheism is debated. Some inscriptions suggest a Jewish-influenced faith centered on a single deity referred to as Rahman, the Merciful. Some scholars believe the Himyarite elite formally converted to Judaism. Others argue it was a more syncretic monotheism, drawing on Jewish and possibly early Christian influences without fully committing to either. What is not debated is that this religious shift placed Himyar at the center of a geopolitical contest that was, by the 6th century AD, becoming existential. The Christian kingdom of Aksum, in present-day Ethiopia and Eritrea, viewed the Arabian Peninsula as both a religious frontier and an economic target. The Byzantine Empire, the dominant Christian superpower of the age, backed Aksum's ambitions and wanted Himyar brought within the Christian sphere. Persia, Byzantium's great rival, had its own interests in keeping the peninsula out of Byzantine influence. Into this pressure cooker stepped a Himyarite king named Yusuf Asar Yathar, known to later Arabic tradition as Du Nuwas, who appears to have been a committed adherent of the kingdom's Jewish-influenced faith. Around 520 AD, in a move that remains difficult to fully interpret from the surviving sources, Du Nuwas launched a violent persecution of the Christian communities in his kingdom. The most devastating incident occurred at the city of Najran, where Christian inhabitants were reportedly massacred in significant numbers, burned in trenches, according to Byzantine and Ethiopian sources. The event sent shockwaves through the Christian world and gave Aksum the justification it had been waiting for. The Aksumite invasion came swiftly. Around 525 AD, an Ethiopian army crossed the Red Sea, defeated Du Nuwas, who, according to tradition, rode his horse into the sea rather than surrender, and placed a Christian client king on the Himyarite throne. The kingdom that had endured for over 6 centuries did not survive the transition intact. What followed was a period of occupation, fragmentation, and eventually Persian intervention that effectively dismantled whatever remained of Himyarite political authority. By the time the Prophet Muhammad was born in Mecca around 570 AD, Himyar as an independent kingdom had ceased to exist for decades. The collapse raises questions that the conventional political narrative does not entirely resolve. A kingdom that had weathered centuries of regional competition, that had successfully absorbed rival states and maintained sophisticated diplomatic relationships with multiple great powers. Why did it fracture so completely under the pressure of the 6th century? Was the religious polarization of that era simply too powerful a force for any small kingdom to navigate? Or were there internal fractures, economic, social, dynastic, that the outside pressures merely accelerated? Archaeological work in Yemen has been severely disrupted by the country's ongoing conflict. Sites that might yield clearer answers remain unexcavated or damaged. Inscriptions that could clarify the religious and political history of Himyar's final decades sit in collections that have not been fully studied. Zafar, the highland capital where Himyarite kings once received the ambassadors of Rome, is today a small village. The stones of the old city are still there, built into walls and houses, repurposed by the centuries. A kingdom that once sat at the crossroads of the ancient world, whose religious choices helped trigger a conflict that reshaped an entire region, reduced finally to building material. What it actually believed, and why it chose the path it did, remains only partially understood. Himyar reminds us that even powerful kingdoms can be erased by the intersection of faith and politics. That belief, when it becomes a weapon in the hands of competing empires, can unmake centuries of accumulated stability in a single generation. But Himyar, at least, left traces. Its inscriptions survive. Its capital can be located. Its kings have names we can read. The conflict that destroyed it is, in broad outline, recoverable. What we turn to now is older, stranger, and in many ways more deeply puzzling. A kingdom that was, for a time, the equal of Egypt and the Hittites, that corresponded with pharaohs as a peer, that fielded armies capable of holding the most contested geography in the ancient Near East, and that vanished so completely that for most of recorded history, nobody even knew it had existed. This is not a kingdom that faded from memory over centuries. It was erased. From the landscape, from the historical record, from the awareness of the civilizations that came after it. So thoroughly that its rediscovery in the modern era came as a genuine shock to the archaeological world. Travel to the upper reaches of the Kabur River in what is today northern Syria and southeastern Turkey. The landscape here is old in a way that is difficult to articulate. A broad, fertile triangle where the rivers of the ancient Near East begin to braid together, where the soil is deep and the horizon is wide, and the tells, those characteristic mounds of accumulated human occupation, rise from the plain with the quiet authority of things that have been waiting a very long time to be understood. Somewhere in this landscape between roughly 1600 and 1350 BC, a state of extraordinary power and sophistication flourished. Its people called it Mitanni. The Egyptians called it Naharan, the land of the river. and for nearly 3 centuries, it was one of the defining forces of the ancient world. Mitanni emerged in a period of regional disruption following the collapse of earlier Bronze Age powers. Its origins are themselves mysterious. The ruling elite appear to have spoken an Indo-Aryan language, linguistically related to Sanskrit, a fact that places them in a cultural and geographic context entirely unexpected for this region. Their gods include names recognizable from the Vedic tradition of South Asia: Mitra, Varuna, Indra, Nasatya. How an Indo-Aryan ruling class came to govern a Hurrian-speaking population in the heart of the ancient Near East is a question that scholars have not resolved. The migration routes, the timelines, the mechanisms of their arrival, all of it remains contested. What is less contested is what they built. At its height, Mitanni controlled a territory stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the foothills of the Zagros Mountains. Its capital, Washukani, sat somewhere in the Kabur Triangle. Its exact location has never been definitively identified, which is itself a remarkable fact for a city that served as the political center of a great power for centuries. The kingdom maintained diplomatic correspondence with Egypt at the highest level. Mitanni princesses were sent to the Egyptian court as royal wives, a practice that cemented the alliance between the two powers across multiple generations. The letters exchanged between the Mitanni king and the Egyptian pharaoh, preserved in the Amarna archive, are written in Akkadian, the diplomatic language of the age, and reveal a relationship of genuine equality between two of the most powerful rulers in the world. They called each other brother, and then, in the span of roughly 2 generations, Mitanni ceased to exist. The conventional account attributes the kingdom's fall to a combination of external pressure and internal fracture. The Hittites, expanding aggressively from their base in Anatolia under the great warrior kings of the Late Bronze Age, struck Mitanni from the west. The Assyrians, who had long chafed under Mitanni overlordship, pushed against them from the east. Caught between 2 expansionist powers while simultaneously dealing with dynastic instability and succession disputes within their own royal family, the Mitanni state buckled. By around 1350 BC, the kingdom had been effectively dismembered. The western territories fell to the Hittites. The eastern regions came under Assyrian control. A rump state called Hanigalbat persisted for a time under Hittite suzerainty, but it was a shadow, a political fiction maintaining the form of a kingdom that had already ceased to function as one. What the conventional account leaves unexplained is the completeness of the erasure. Washukani, the capital, a city that must have contained palaces, temples, archives, and all the physical apparatus of a great power's administrative center, has simply never been found. Generations of archaeologists have proposed candidate sites. The most frequently discussed is Tel Fakaria, a substantial mound in the Kabur region that has yielded important finds from the relevant period. But excavations there have not produced the definitive evidence: the royal inscriptions, the palatial architecture, the sheer scale that would be expected of a capital city. The search continues. The absence of Washukani is not the only puzzle. Mitanni left behind remarkably few inscriptions in its own name. Most of what we know about the kingdom comes from the records of its neighbors and enemies: Egyptian diplomatic archives, Hittite annals, Assyrian king lists. For a state that corresponded with pharaohs as equals and controlled some of the most valuable agricultural and strategic land in the ancient world, the thinness of its own documentary legacy is extraordinary. Some researchers have suggested that the Hittites and Assyrians engaged in deliberate destruction of Mitanni's written record, that the erasure was not merely the result of time and circumstance, but of intentional obliteration, the ancient equivalent of rewriting history by eliminating the sources. If so, they were remarkably thorough. A kingdom whose princesses married pharaohs, whose kings exchanged gold and greetings with the rulers of Egypt, whose charioteers were among the most feared soldiers of the Bronze Age, reduced to a handful of clay tablets in other people's archives, and a capital city that may still be sitting, unrecognized, beneath the soil of northern Syria. Somewhere in that wide, flat, ancient landscape, Washukani is waiting. Whether we will ever recognize it when we find it, that remains an open question. Washukani may lie buried and unrecognized beneath the soil of northern Syria, a capital city hiding in plain sight, waiting for the right question to be asked of the right mound. There is something quietly humbling about that, about the fact that a great power can vanish so completely that even its heart cannot be located. But Mitanni, for all its elusiveness, existed on land. Its traces, however thin, are recoverable in principle. What we turn to now presents a different kind of challenge entirely. A city built not on solid ground, but on water, on a reef, on a foundation that should have made large-scale construction impossible, and yet somehow did not. We leave the river plains of the ancient Near East and travel east, far east, across the full breadth of the Asian continent and out into the open Pacific Ocean. To a small island in Micronesia that most people could not find on a map, and yet which contains, sitting in its coastal shallows, one of the most extraordinary and least understood architectural achievements in all of human history. Approach Pompeii by boat in the early morning when the mist is still sitting low over the water, and you will see it before you fully understand what you are seeing. Rising from a lagoon on the island's southeastern coast, half submerged, half reclaimed by mangrove and vine and the slow patience of the tropics. A city. Not the ruins of a city in the conventional sense, with collapsed walls and broken columns lying in recognizable patterns. Something stranger than that. Massive basalt columns, some weighing 50 tons or more, stacked and interlocked in log cabin fashion to form walls, platforms, and enclosures that rise directly from the tidal water. Canals running between artificial islets. The whole complex covering nearly 11 square miles of reef and lagoon. This is non-Madol, and it should not exist. The basalt used in its construction does not come from the reef. It comes from the far side of Pompeii, from quarry sites miles away across open water and difficult terrain. How the builders transported columns of this size and weight, using the technology available in the Pacific during the first millennium AD, is a question that engineers and archaeologists have studied seriously and answered only partially. Experimental archaeology has demonstrated that large rafts and coordinated labor could, in theory, have moved the stones. The mathematics work, just barely. But the sheer scale of the operation, an estimated 750,000 metric tons of basalt moved and placed over several centuries, pushes against the limits of what seems practically achievable for an island population of the size that Pompeii could have supported. The oral traditions of Pompeii's people do not offer a logistical explanation. They offer something older. The founding of non-Madol is attributed in the traditional accounts to twin sorcerers named Olisipa and Olasopa, who arrived by canoe from a mythical western land and used magic to float the stones into place. Researchers treat this as mythology, which it almost certainly is in its literal form. But mythology often encodes cultural memory of events that were real. The question is always how much of the original event survives the encoding. Construction at non-Madol appears to have begun around 1 AD, with the most intensive building period occurring between roughly 1200 and 1500 AD under the Sudden dynasty. A ruling class that, by the accounts preserved in Pompeian oral tradition, governed with increasing harshness and extracted tribute and labor from the island's population with a coercive thoroughness that eventually generated serious resistance. At its height, non-Madol functioned as the political and ceremonial capital of the Sudden domain. The islets served different functions. Some were residential, some ceremonial, some reserved for the preparation of food or the keeping of sea turtles for ritual purposes. The central mortuary islet, Nandawaz, contained the tombs of the Sudden rulers within walls that still stand, in places, 25 feet high. Access to the city was controlled. Commoners were reportedly forbidden from entering certain areas on pain of death. Then, sometime around 1628 AD, a warrior figure named Esokalekal arrived from the island of Khosrei with a force of warriors and overthrew the last Sudden ruler. And after that, non-Madol was abandoned. Not repurposed, not gradually depopulated over generations. Abandoned. The new rulers of Pompeii did not move into the existing administrative center. They did not occupy the tombs of their predecessors or the ceremonial spaces of the dynasty they had defeated. They left Nan Madol to the water and the mangroves, and it has been slowly returning to both ever since. The practical explanations for the abandonment are not difficult to construct. The city was, by any measure, an extraordinarily difficult place to live. There is no fresh water on the reef. Food had to be brought in constantly. The tidal environment bred disease. Maintaining the infrastructure of a city built on water required unrelenting labor. Without the coercive authority of the Sodler dynasty to organize and compel that labor, the city may simply have been impossible to sustain. But the oral tradition suggests something additional, that Madol carried a weight beyond the merely logistical, that it was a place associated with the power of a defeated and delegitimized ruling class, and that its abandonment was not just practical, but deliberate. A rejection, a refusal to inhabit the spaces of the old order. Some researchers have noted unusually high levels of basalt-derived minerals in the water and sediment around Nan Madol, and have speculated about whether environmental contamination of the fresh water supply may have contributed to the city's untenability. The hypothesis is not widely accepted, but it has not been fully dismissed. What remains is what the water has not yet taken. The walls of Nandawas, the canal system still faintly traceable through the mangrove roots, the stacked basalt columns rising from the lagoon like the remnants of an argument that nobody finished. Nan Madol was built at enormous cost, sustained through what appears to have been enormous suffering, and then left without a backward glance. Why a civilization would pour that much of itself into a place, and then walk away from it so completely, is a question the reef has not yet answered. Nan Madol was abandoned by choice, or something close to it. A deliberate turning away from a place that had cost too much, demanded too much, and carried the wrong kind of memory. The city was left to the water not because the water took it, but because the people decided, in whatever way collective decisions are made, that it was finished. We have seen that pattern before in this journey. The organized departure from Chaco Canyon, the methodical closing of rooms and sealing of spaces. The sense, recurring across cultures and centuries, that sometimes a civilization does not collapse so much as conclude, that the ending is as intentional as the beginning, even when the reasons remain opaque. What we turn to now did not end by choice. It ended by erosion, slow, grinding, multi-generational erosion of the kind that is almost impossible to see while it is happening, and almost impossible to fully explain once it is done. And it is a kingdom we have already met, briefly, in this exploration. When we stood in the ruins of Himyar and watched an Aksumite army cross the Red Sea to overthrow a dynasty, we were watching Aksum at the height of its power, confident, expansionist, capable of projecting military force across open water onto a foreign shore. That was the 6th century AD. That was Aksum in its prime. What happened to that empire afterward is a story that deserves to be told in full. Stand in the highlands of northern Ethiopia, in the Tigray region, at an elevation of roughly 7,000 feet, and look at what remains. The stele field of Aksum, towering obelisks of granite, some still standing, some long fallen, carved from single pieces of stone and hauled to this plateau by methods that remain incompletely understood. The tallest that still stands reaches nearly 70 feet. The largest that ever stood, now lying shattered on the ground where it fell, possibly during its own erection, would have exceeded 100 feet. These are not small monuments. They are statements, declarations of permanence cut from the living rock of the Ethiopian highlands and raised against a sky that has watched them for nearly 2,000 years. Behind them, the ruins of a city that was, at its height, one of the 4 greatest powers in the world. Aksum emerges into clear historical view around the 1st century AD, though its roots are older. It sat at the intersection of 2 of the ancient world's most important economic systems. the Red Sea trade network connecting Rome and Byzantium to India and Arabia, and the interior African trade routes bringing gold, ivory, and slaves from the continent's heart to its coasts. Controlling that intersection made Aksum extraordinarily wealthy. The kingdom minted its own coins, one of only a handful of states in the ancient world to do so, in gold, silver, and bronze, and those coins circulated across the Indian Ocean trading world as markers of Aksumite power and reach. In the 4th century AD, under King Ezana, Aksum became one of the first states in the world to officially adopt Christianity, predating the Roman Empire's full embrace of the faith and establishing an Ethiopian Christian tradition that has survived, in continuous practice, to the present day. Ezana's conversion was recorded in royal inscriptions in 3 languages, Greek, Ge'ez, and South Arabian, that still stand in Aksum, carved into stone with the confidence of a king who expected them to be read forever. For 3 centuries after Ezana, Aksum remained a major power. It intervened in Arabian politics. It maintained diplomatic contact with Byzantium and Persia. Its merchants and sailors operated across a vast maritime network. And then, with a gradual but unmistakable finality, it contracted. The traditional explanation centers on the rise of Islam in the 7th century AD. The rapid Arab expansion across the Middle East and North Africa fundamentally disrupted the trade networks that had sustained Aksum's economy. The Red Sea, which had been an Aksumite sphere of influence, became an Arab-dominated waterway. The ports and trade routes that had funneled wealth into the Ethiopian highlands were progressively cut off or redirected. A kingdom built on commerce found its commercial foundations dissolving beneath it. This explanation has genuine force. The timing aligns, the consequences are traceable, but it does not account for everything. Environmental degradation appears in the archaeological and paleoclimate record well before the Islamic expansion. The highlands around Aksum show evidence of significant deforestation and soil erosion beginning in the later centuries of the 1st millennium AD, the result of intensive agriculture and construction over several centuries. The same pattern that haunted Cahokia and Chaco Canyon appears here, a civilization that consumed its landscape faster than the landscape could recover, gradually undermining the agricultural base that fed its population and the timber supply that built its ships and fired its industry. Some researchers argue that this environmental strain was already weakening Aksum before the Arab expansion made the situation critical, that the Islamic disruption of trade was the final pressure applied to a structure already compromised from within. There is also the question of a figure known in Ethiopian tradition as Yodit, or Gudit, a queen whose origins are debated and whose historicity some scholars question, but who appears in multiple sources as a destroyer of Aksumite power sometime around the 9th or 10th century AD. The traditions describe her as a conqueror who burned churches, overthrew the ruling dynasty, and brought the remaining structures of Aksumite political authority to a final end. Whether she was a local ruler, a representative of non-Christian highland peoples resisting Aksumite domination, or something else entirely, the sources do not agree. Her origins, her religion, her motivations, all are disputed. What is not disputed is that by the 10th century AD, Aksum had ceased to function as a political center. The capital was abandoned. The stelae stood in an emptying city. The coins stopped being minted. The kings, if they still existed, had moved elsewhere. A kingdom that had raised the largest stone monuments in the ancient world, that had sent armies across the Red Sea and corresponded with emperors, that had built a Christian tradition robust enough to survive 2,000 years of subsequent history, reduced finally to a provincial town in the Ethiopian highlands, remarkable mainly for the evidence of what it had once been. The stelae are still there. The inscriptions of Ezana are still legible. The coins are in museums across 3 continents. But why Aksum declined when it did, as completely as it did, and whether the causes we have identified are sufficient to explain the totality of its ending, that remains a question the highlands have not fully answered. Aksum's decline was written in soil and trade routes, in the slow exhaustion of a landscape and the redirection of the commerce that had sustained a kingdom for centuries. It is the kind of ending that feels, in retrospect, almost inevitable. The pressures were real. The timeline is traceable. The causes, however incomplete, are at least partially visible. What we turn to now is different in a specific and important way. This is a civilization whose ending is not primarily mysterious. We understand broadly why it failed. What is mysterious is almost everything else about it. How it existed at all, what it built beneath the ground, how it sustained a complex, literate, militarily capable state in one of the most waterless places on the surface of the Earth for nearly 1,000 years, using an engineering solution so audacious that modern researchers still find themselves pausing over it. The Garamantians are not a household name. They should be. Travel south from the Mediterranean coast of Libya, south past Tripoli, south past the scrubland that marks the edge of the habitable world in the imagination of the ancient Romans, and keep going. The landscape empties. The green drains out of it. The air becomes drier with each hour, the ground harder, the horizon more absolute. You are descending into the Fezzan, a vast basin of sand and rock in the central Sahara, ringed by plateaus and massifs, sitting in the heart of one of the most arid regions on Earth. Average annual rainfall here is measured in single-digit millimeters. In some years, it does not rain at all. And yet in this place, between roughly 500 BC and 700 AD, a civilization of considerable sophistication flourished. Its people built cities, maintained long-distance trade routes connecting sub-Saharan Africa to the Mediterranean world, fielded armies capable of raiding the Roman province of North Africa, kept slaves, grew crops, buried their dead in tens of thousands of elaborate stone tombs that still mark the Fezzan landscape in staggering numbers, and did all of this in a desert that, by any modern assessment, cannot support that level of human activity. The Romans knew them and respected them in the complicated way that Rome respected peoples it could neither fully conquer nor fully ignore. Herodotus mentioned them in the 5th century BC. Pliny the Elder wrote about them. Roman military expeditions pushed into the Fezzan and made contact, sometimes hostile, sometimes commercial, with Garamantian communities. The Romans described them as skilled charioteers and raiders, capable of striking deep into Roman territory and withdrawing before a response could be organized. They were not a simple desert people. They were a state. Their capital, Garama, located near the modern Libyan town of Jerma, has been excavated sufficiently to reveal a settlement of genuine urban character. Mudbrick architecture, imported goods from the Mediterranean and sub-Saharan Africa, evidence of craft production and administrative organization. The Garamantians were literate, using a script related to the ancient Tifinagh writing system still used by Tuareg people today. They had a king. They had a social hierarchy complex enough to generate the enormous variation in burial wealth visible across their tens of thousands of graves. But none of this addresses the central question. Where did the water come from? The answer lies underground, and it is, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary engineering achievements of the ancient world. The Garamantians built fogaras, an ancient form of underground aqueduct known in other parts of the world as qanats. These were not simple trenches or surface canals. They were tunnels dug horizontally into the gravel aquifers beneath the Fezzan's ancient lake beds, following the precise gradient needed to allow water to flow by gravity alone from the water table to the surface agricultural areas miles away. The tunnels were accessed and maintained through vertical shafts sunk from the surface at regular intervals, creating those characteristic lines of circular depressions that are still visible from the air across the Fezzan landscape today, stretching for miles in every direction like stitching on the face of the desert. The total length of the Garamantian Fogara system has been estimated at over 3,000 kilometers. It was dug entirely by hand, maintained continuously over centuries, and represented an investment of labor so colossal that the numbers strain comprehension. Some researchers believe the system required slave labor on an industrial scale to construct and maintain, which in turn required the slave raids and trans-Saharan trade networks that Roman sources describe with a mixture of alarm and commercial interest. The civilization was, in a very real sense, built on its tunnels. And when the tunnels began to fail, the civilization followed. The water table beneath the Fazan is fossil water, ancient precipitation from a wetter geological period, stored in aquifers that are not being replenished by modern rainfall. Once extracted, it is gone. The Garamantians were, without knowing it, drawing down a finite account. As the water table dropped over centuries of intensive extraction, the fogaras had to be dug deeper and longer to reach it. The labor cost of maintenance increased. The returns diminished. At some point, and the archaeological evidence suggests this process was well underway by the later centuries of Garamantian civilization, the system became impossible to sustain. The Arab expansion of the 7th century AD provided the external pressure that coincided with this internal exhaustion. Arab forces moved across North Africa with speed and force, disrupting the political structures of the region. The Garamantian state, already weakened, did not survive the transition. The cities were abandoned or absorbed. The trade networks dissolved. The fogaras, without the organized labor to maintain them, silted up and failed. And the desert, which the Garamantians had held back for nearly 1,000 years through sheer engineering will, moved back in. What remains is extraordinary in its quiet way. The tomb fields of the Fazan, tens of thousands of stone burial monuments spread across the landscape in numbers that reflect a population and a duration of occupation far larger than most people imagine when they think of ancient Saharan civilization. The lines of fogara shafts still visible from satellite imagery, tracing the invisible water highways that made everything possible. The ruins of Garama, partially excavated, partially still buried. And underneath the sand, the tunnels themselves, some of them possibly still intact, preserved by the same dryness that killed the civilization that built them. A people who solved the problem of the desert so completely that they built a 1,000-year kingdom on the answer, and then watched that answer slowly run out. Whether any part of their tunnel system still carries water somewhere beneath the Fezan, unseen and unmapped, is a question that has not yet been fully investigated. The Garamantians held back the desert through engineering, through tunnels and gradients, and the organized will of a civilization that refused to accept what its landscape insisted was impossible. When the water ran out, the will was not enough. The desert reclaimed with patience everything that ingenuity had temporarily taken from it. There is a lesson in that, perhaps, that civilizations built on a single brilliant solution are vulnerable in a specific way, that the very mastery which makes them possible can become the constraint that makes them fragile. When the solution stops working, there is no fallback. There is only the desert, waiting. We leave the Sahara now and cross the Atlantic, moving south and west to the Pacific coast of South America. The landscape could hardly be more different, and yet the dynamic is, in certain ways, eerily familiar. Another civilization. Another extraordinary feat of environmental management. Another ending that the people who lived through it could not have seen coming clearly enough to prevent. Stand on the northern coast of Peru and look at the terrain that produced one of the most visually sophisticated cultures of the ancient Americas. To the east, the Andes rise in successive walls of rock and snow, vast and indifferent. To the west, the Pacific, cold, gray, and powerful, its upwelling currents bringing nutrients to the surface that make these waters among the most biologically productive on Earth. Between the mountains and the ocean, a narrow coastal strip of desert, cut at intervals by river valleys that descend from the highlands carrying water and sediment. And in those valleys, the possibility of agriculture in an otherwise waterless landscape. This is where the Moche built their world. Between roughly 100 and 800 AD, the Moche civilization occupied a series of these river valleys along Peru's northern coast, developing a culture of remarkable complexity and artistic achievement. Their ceramics are among the finest produced anywhere in the ancient Americas. Portrait vessels that capture individual human faces with a psychological realism that feels startlingly modern. Narrative scenes depicting ritual, warfare, and daily life in precise and sometimes disturbing detail. Their metalwork in gold, silver, and copper was technically sophisticated beyond what their contemporaries in most parts of the world were producing. Their monumental architecture, most dramatically the Huaca del Sol, a stepped pyramid constructed from an estimated 140 million adobe bricks, still dominates the landscape of the Moche Valley. They were not a simple agricultural society. They were a stratified theocratic state with warrior elites, specialist craftspeople, a priestly class that conducted elaborate public rituals, and an agricultural system capable of feeding a substantial population in a landscape that received almost no rainfall through an intricate network of irrigation canals drawing water from the mountain rivers. And then, over the course of the 6th and 7th centuries AD, the Moche world unraveled. The archaeological record of that unraveling is, in places, genuinely disturbing. Evidence of ritual sacrifice at Moche sites is well established and long recognized. The iconography is explicit, and the physical evidence confirms it. Bound prisoners, elaborately costumed priests, the careful choreography of ceremonial killing at the summit of the great platform mounds. This was not aberrant behavior in the Moche context. It was institutionalized, religious, woven into the cosmological framework of a society that understood blood as the currency of cosmic maintenance. But in the layers corresponding to the period of crisis, something shifts. The sacrifices appear to increase. The evidence of violence becomes less ceremonial and more desperate, or so some researchers have interpreted it. Whether this represents a society doubling down on ritual responses to existential threats, or simply a change in the archaeological visibility of practices that were always present, is debated. The interpretation of ritual violence is never straightforward. The environmental record, however, is less ambiguous. The period between roughly 550 and 650 AD shows evidence of one of the most severe El Niño events in the region's history, a prolonged disruption of the Pacific climate system that would have brought catastrophic flooding to the coastal valleys, while simultaneously triggering drought in the highland catchments that fed the irrigation systems. The Moche agricultural infrastructure, sophisticated as it was designed for the normal variability of the Peruvian coastal environment. It was not designed for this. The floods would have destroyed canals, buried fields under sediment, and destabilized the sand dunes that the Moche had laboriously managed to keep clear of their agricultural land. The subsequent drought would have meant that even once the flooding receded, the rivers were not delivering enough water to make the irrigation system functional. Decades of accumulated agricultural infrastructure, the canals, the field systems, the carefully maintained landscape, damaged or destroyed. Dendrochronology and ice core records from the Andes confirm the broad outlines. The climate event was real. Its severity was unusual. Its timing aligns with the period of Moche disruption. But the Moche did not simply stop in the face of flooding. They moved. The evidence from the archaeological record suggests a period of significant population displacement, communities relocating, political centers shifting, the old valley hierarchies dissolving and reforming in different configurations. The process appears to have taken generations rather than years. What is less well understood is why the Moche never fully recovered. Other coastal Andean civilizations had faced climatic disruptions and adapted. The Moche's response, increasingly visible in the archaeological record as a society under acute internal stress, suggests that the environmental crisis intersected with something in the political and social structure that made recovery particularly difficult. Some researchers point to the highly centralized, ritual-dependent nature of Moche authority, a theocratic system that legitimized its rulers through their ability to mediate between the human and supernatural worlds faces a specific crisis when the natural world stops behaving as the cosmological system predicts. Floods that destroy crops are not just an agricultural problem. They are a theological one. If the priests cannot hold back the chaos, the system that depends on their claimed power begins to lose its coherence. The fringe interpretations at the edges of Moche scholarship involve readings of the iconographic record that some researchers believe contain encoded astronomical or climatic knowledge, predictive frameworks built into the ceremonial art that may have been attempts to understand and anticipate the environmental cycles that govern their world. Whether the Moche were, in some sense, trying to read what was coming and simply could not read it clearly enough is a question that sits at the boundary between archaeology and speculation. Huaca del Sol still stands in the Moche Valley, reduced from its original size by centuries of erosion and by Spanish colonial-era water diversion that deliberately destroyed part of it in search of buried gold. What remains is still enormous, a monument to a civilization that built ambitiously, lived intensely, and ended without leaving a written explanation of why. The river that once fed their canals still flows down from the Andes beside it. Whether the Moche saw their ending coming, and whether their rituals were a response to that recognition or simply a coincidence of timing, the ceramics and the pyramids are not saying. The Moche read their world through ceramic and ceremony, through the language of ritual and the movement of water down mountain slopes. When that language stopped producing answers, the society that depended on it began to dissolve. The environment had changed faster than the framework built to understand it could adapt. That tension between a civilization's model of the world and the world's refusal to conform to it is one we have encountered repeatedly in this journey. It appears in the archaeological record of cultures separated by oceans and millennia, suggesting something not about any particular people, but about the nature of complexity itself. About how the very sophistication that allows a civilization to flourish can become, under the wrong conditions, the mechanism of its undoing. We move now from the Pacific coast of South America to the opposite side of the world. From a narrow coastal desert fed by mountain rivers to a landlocked basin surrounded, almost completely, by some of the highest mountain ranges on Earth. The geography could hardly be more different, and yet the dynamic, a people making improbable life in an impossible place, and then vanishing, is, by now, familiar. Look at a map of Central Asia and find the Tarim Basin, a vast depression in what is today the Xinjiang region of western China, ringed to the north by the Tian Shan Mountains, to the south by the Kunlun Range, and to the west by the Pamirs. In the center of the basin sits the Taklamakan Desert, one of the largest and most inhospitable sand deserts in the world. Its name in the local Uyghur language is often translated as the desert you go into, but do not come out of. Whether or not that etymology is precisely accurate, the sentiment is not wrong. Summer temperatures exceed 50 degrees Celsius. Winter temperatures drop well below freezing. Sandstorms can last for days. The interior receives almost no precipitation. And yet around the edges of this basin, fed by the glacier melt coming off the surrounding mountain ranges, a series of oasis cities existed for nearly 2,000 years. Nia, Lulan, Dandan Oilik, Endere, Miran. Small kingdoms and city-states strung like beads along the routes that would become the Silk Road, connecting China to Central Asia, to Persia, to the Mediterranean world. These were not simple waypoints. They were communities of real complexity, with Buddhist monasteries, administrative systems, written records in multiple languages, textile traditions of considerable sophistication, and populations that the DNA evidence now suggests were ethnically diverse in ways that were, until recently, entirely unexpected. The mummies are what brought the Tarim Basin to wide public attention. Preserved by the extreme dryness of the desert environment, human remains have been recovered from Tarim Basin cemeteries dating back as far as 2000 BC, and many of them display physical characteristics that place them far outside the expected genetic profile of East Asian populations. Light hair, tall stature, features associated with populations from far to the west. The textile fragments found with them, plaids and tartans woven in techniques associated with Bronze Age Europe, deepened the mystery considerably. Who were these people? How did they get here? And what does their presence in the heart of Asia 2,000 years before the Silk Road's peak suggest about the movement of peoples across the ancient world? The genetic analysis published in recent years has begun to provide answers that are, if anything, more surprising than the questions. The earliest Tarim mummies appear to represent a population descended from the ancient North Eurasians, a genetic lineage associated with the ancient steppes, distinct from both East Asian and Western Eurasian populations. They did not, the evidence suggests, migrate from Europe. They were, in a sense, a remnant of an older world, a population that had survived in the Tarim Basin in relative isolation while the peoples around them changed. The later oasis kingdoms of the first millennium AD were ethnically and culturally more complex, a genuine crossroads population absorbing influences from China, India, Persia, and the nomadic steppe cultures. Their written records survive in Kharosthi, Brahmi, Sogdian, Chinese, and Tocharian, a now extinct Indo-European language that has no close modern relatives and whose presence in the Tarim Basin remains one of the more remarkable puzzles of historical linguistics. The cities themselves were sophisticated enough to generate substantial administrative archives. The documents recovered from Nia, a site buried under sand at the southern edge of the Taklamakan and excavated by the explorer Aurel Stein in the early 20th century, include legal contracts, official correspondence, and household records written on wooden tablets that the desert preserved in extraordinary condition. These are the mundane records of a functioning society: property disputes, debt agreements, orders for supplies. A civilization doing the ordinary business of being alive. And then, between roughly the 3rd and 9th centuries AD, the timing varies by site, the cities were abandoned. The process was not uniform. Some sites show evidence of gradual depopulation over generations. Others suggest a more abrupt departure. Nia appears to have been left relatively suddenly. Personal possessions still in place, food storage intact, as though the population departed expecting to return, and simply never did. The most widely supported explanation is hydrological. The rivers and streams fed by glacier melt are not stable over centuries. Shifts in climate, changes in the glaciers themselves, and the natural variability of water flow in an arid environment mean that the water supply sustaining any given oasis could diminish or disappear entirely with relatively little warning. A city built on a specific water source has no resilience against the loss of that source. When the river shifts or dries, the city follows. Archaeological survey has confirmed that the ancient river channels feeding several of the abandoned sites are no longer active, that the water that sustained Nia and Lulan is simply not there anymore, diverted by geological and climatic processes that operated on timescales far longer than any human administration could plan for. Political disruption compounded the environmental pressure. The expansion of Tang Dynasty China into the Tarim Basin in the 7th century AD, followed by the Arab expansion into Central Asia and the subsequent Tibetan incursions, created a period of intense military and political competition across the region that destabilized the small oasis kingdoms, regardless of their water supply. But the abandoned cities sit under the sand in a silence that the political explanations do not fully account for. Dandan Oilik, the city of ivory houses as its name translates, lies buried under dunes that have been shifting over it for more than 1,000 years. Its painted panels, its Buddhist shrines, its everyday objects are still there, preserved by the same desert that covered them. The people who left Nia in such apparent haste, what did they take with them? Where did they go? The wooden tablets record their disputes and debts with meticulous care, but nothing in the surviving archive announces the end. One day, the records simply stop. The records of Nia stop without announcement. No final entry, no closing statement, just the ordinary business of a functioning society. And then silence, preserved in wood and sand for 1,000 years. We have encountered that silence many times now in this journey. The administrative archive that simply ends, the city left with possessions in place. The population that departed without, as far as the evidence tells us, leaving any account of why. There is something in that particular kind of absence, the interrupted ordinary, that is more unsettling than dramatic destruction. Catastrophe, at least, explains itself. Silence does not. We carry that silence with us now as we move southwest. out of the high desert basins of Central Asia, across the Indian Ocean, and deep into the interior of the African continent. To a plateau in the southern African highlands where the air is clear and the granite hills rise in rounded domes from the surrounding grassland, and where, in the middle of all of that open, sunlit landscape, something stands that has no business being there if you approach it with the assumptions most people carry about the deep history of sub-Saharan Africa. The assumptions are wrong. They have always been wrong. And the story of how wrong they were is, in its own way, as much a part of this mystery as the ruins themselves. Drive southeast from Masvingo in present-day Zimbabwe, and the walls appear before the full context does. Stone. Dry stone construction. No mortar, no cut faces, just granite blocks shaped and placed with a precision that has held for 7 centuries without the intervention of anything binding them together except geometry and weight. The outer wall of the great enclosure is nearly 250 meters in circumference. In places, it stands over 11 meters tall and nearly 5 meters thick at its base. It was built from an estimated 1 million granite blocks, each one split from the natural rock of the surrounding hills and carried to this site by hand. Inside the outer wall, a conical tower, solid, without internal chambers, without apparent function beyond its own presence, rises over 9 meters from the ground. Its purpose has never been satisfactorily explained. It is simply there, precise and permanent, in the center of a space whose original meaning has been largely lost. This is Great Zimbabwe, the largest ancient structure in sub-Saharan Africa south of the Sahara, the center of a kingdom that, at its height between roughly 1200 and 1450 AD, controlled the gold trade of the interior plateau and maintained commercial connections stretching east to the Swahili coast, across the Indian Ocean to Persia, Arabia, and as far as China. The Chinese porcelain found at Great Zimbabwe during excavation was not a surprise to historians of the Indian Ocean trade. It was a confirmation. The plateau kingdoms of southern Africa were not isolated. They were participants in one of the most extensive commercial networks in the medieval world. And then, sometime in the mid-15th century, Great Zimbabwe was abandoned. The explanation that colonial-era researchers reached for with an eagerness that reveals far more about their assumptions than about the evidence, was that Great Zimbabwe could not have been built by the ancestors of the people living near it when Europeans arrived. The walls were attributed, variously, to Phoenicians, to the Queen of Sheba, to ancient Arab traders, to almost anyone other than the Shona-speaking peoples whose oral traditions consistently claimed it as their own. This was not archaeology. It was ideology dressed in the language of inquiry, and it did significant damage, both to the physical site, which early excavators disturbed without proper method, and to the historical record, which was interpreted through a framework designed to produce a predetermined conclusion. The actual archaeology, conducted properly from the mid-20th century onward, is unambiguous. Great Zimbabwe was built by the ancestors of the Shona people. The construction techniques, the pottery styles, the oral traditions, and the genetic continuity between the builders and the present population of the region all point in the same direction. The question of who built it was never, in an evidentiary sense, genuinely open. It was made open by people who needed it to be. Setting that history aside, the genuine mysteries remain. The abandonment of Great Zimbabwe in the mid-15th century is real, and its causes are not fully understood. The most widely accepted explanation involves a combination of environmental depletion and political realignment. The plateau around Great Zimbabwe could support only a certain population density before the land began to show the strain. Deforestation, soil exhaustion, declining agricultural productivity in the immediate vicinity of the capital. A center that drew population and resources from a wide region would eventually consume its local environment faster than it could be replenished. Simultaneously, the gold trade that had sustained Great Zimbabwe's political dominance appears to have shifted. New centers, particularly Kami, associated with the Torwa state further west, were emerging as the primary nodes of the interior trade network. The economic logic that had made Great Zimbabwe's location valuable was changing, and the political authority it had anchored was changing with it. But the specifics of the transition remain unclear. Was the abandonment gradual, a slow bleeding of population toward the new centers over decades? Or was there a more decisive moment, a political rupture that accelerated the departure? The archaeological layers at the site have not been fully resolved on this question, partly because of the damage done by early unscientific excavation, and partly because the stratigraphy of a dry stone site without mortar is inherently difficult to date with precision. The oral traditions of the Shona and Rosvi peoples preserve fragmented memories of Great Zimbabwe, of its founding, of the power it represented, of the spiritual significance attached to its walls and enclosures. These traditions are not straightforward historical documents. They have been transmitted across generations in forms that reflect the needs and contexts of each telling. But they consistently treat Great Zimbabwe as a place of genuine importance, a center whose abandonment was meaningful rather than arbitrary. The conical tower stands in its enclosure without explanation. Researchers have proposed that it represented a grain bin, a symbol of royal abundance. Others have suggested it was a symbolic mountain, a terrestrial echo of the granite domes that characterize the sacred geography of the Shona world. Others still maintain that its function was primarily visual, a statement of power and permanence visible from outside the walls, communicating authority to anyone approaching the great enclosure. The granite from which it was built came from hills that are still there, still rounded and smooth against the southern African sky. Whatever the tower was meant to say, whatever message its builders encoded in a million hand-carried stones, the people who could read it most clearly are gone. And the walls have been keeping their meaning to themselves for 6 centuries. The walls of Great Zimbabwe have kept their meaning for 6 centuries. The conical tower stands without a confirmed purpose. The million stones that built the great enclosure were carried by hands whose owners left no written account of what they were building toward, or what they believed they were leaving behind. Absence of writing is something we have returned to repeatedly in this journey. The civilizations that left monuments but not explanations, structures but not sentences. It is a particular kind of historical frustration, the feeling of standing in front of something enormous and being unable to ask it a direct question. What we turn to now took that condition to its extreme. This was a civilization larger in geographic extent than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. It was arguably the most urbanistically sophisticated society of its age, with standardized weights and measures, a sewage and sanitation infrastructure that would not be matched in Europe for nearly 3,000 years, and a trade network that stretched from the mountains of Afghanistan to the coast of Arabia. It left behind hundreds of sites, thousands of artifacts, and a script that appears on countless seals and tablets. That script has never been deciphered. We know, in other words, that they had something to say. We simply cannot read it. Stand in the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro in present-day Pakistan, on the floodplain of the Indus River, and try to hold the scale of what was here in your mind. At its peak, around 2500 BC, this was one of the largest cities in the world, home to perhaps 40,000 people, laid out on a grid of streets wide enough for carts to pass, served by a municipal water system with covered drains running beneath the roads, supplied with standardized baked brick from a production system consistent enough that the same brick dimensions appear across sites separated by hundreds of miles. The standardization is, in its quiet way, one of the most remarkable things about the Harappan civilization. Weights found at sites across the entire Indus Valley system conform to the same scale. The bricks conform to the same ratios. The street widths conform to the same planning principles. This is not the kind of consistency that emerges by accident or by parallel development. It implies administration. It implies communication. It implies a degree of political and economic integration across an enormous territory that most people hearing about it for the first time find difficult to believe. And yet the Harappan civilization, also called the Indus Valley civilization, appears to have achieved this integration without the monumental temples and palaces that characterized its contemporaries in Egypt and Mesopotamia. There are no pyramid equivalents at Mohenjo-Daro, no grand royal tombs with treasure-filled chambers, no inscriptions proclaiming the glory of a king. The Great Bath at Mohenjo-Daro, a watertight, bitumen-lined pool of evident ritual or civic importance, is the most impressive single structure at the site, and it is a communal space, not a monument to individual power. Where were the rulers of this civilization? How did it maintain its extraordinary standardization across such a vast territory without, apparently, the coercive apparatus of kingship that every other complex society of its age deployed? These questions do not have answers. They are among the most genuinely puzzling aspects of a civilization that is puzzling in almost every dimension. The trade network that connected the Harappan world to the outside was extensive and well documented from the other end. Mesopotamian records from the 3rd millennium BC refer to a trading partner called Meluha, a distant land that sent carnelian beads, ivory, timber, and other goods westward by sea. Harappan seals have been found at sites in Mesopotamia. Mesopotamian goods have been found at Harappan sites. The connection was real, sustained, and commercially significant. And then, sometime between 1900 and 1700 BC, it ended. Not just the trade with Mesopotamia, the entire network. The cities contracted, were abandoned, or shrank dramatically. The standardization dissolved. Brick sizes diverged. Weights became inconsistent. The planning principles that had governed Harappan urbanism for centuries disappeared from the archaeological record. Population shifted eastward, away from the Indus floodplain and toward the Ganges plain and the foothills of the Himalayas. The script, whatever it encoded, stopped being used. The Great Bath silted up. Mohenjo-Daro was eventually buried under its own accumulating debris. The collapse of the Harappan trade network and urban system is one of the most discussed and least resolved problems in the archaeology of the ancient world. The earliest and most dramatic explanation, invasion, dominated scholarship for much of the 20th century. The archaeologist Mortimer Wheeler, excavating Mohenjo-Daro in the 1940s, found skeletons in the upper layers of the site and interpreted them as evidence of violent death. He connected this to the arrival of Indo-Aryan peoples from the northwest and the references in the Rig Veda to the destruction of fortified settlements. The invasion hypothesis was vivid and narratively satisfying. It is also, by the current consensus of the field, largely unsupported by the evidence. The skeletal remains. Wheeler interpreted as massacre victims appear, on closer analysis, to represent deaths distributed over a considerable period of time. Not a single violent event. The archaeological signature of conquest, burned buildings, weapons embedded in walls, evidence of military destruction, is largely absent from the Harappan sites. The invasion hypothesis has not been abandoned entirely, but it no longer holds the explanatory authority it once did. What has replaced it is a more complex and, in some ways, more interesting picture, multiple overlapping pressures operating over several centuries. Climate change is now the most widely discussed primary driver. Paleoclimate data from the region suggests that the monsoon system that watered the Indus flood plain began weakening significantly around 2100 BC. A shift that reduced river flows, lowered water tables, and made the intensive agriculture that sustained Harappan urban populations progressively less viable. The rivers themselves may have shifted course. The Gagar-Hakra river system, which ran through the heart of the Harappan world and supported some of its largest sites, appears to have diminished dramatically during this period as the glacial and monsoon sources feeding it declined. A civilization built on the reliable flooding and recession of specific river systems has no resilience against those rivers changing their behavior. The Harappans had, in a sense, built their world on a climatic assumption that the climate then withdrew. Tectonic activity has also been proposed as a contributing factor. The region sits in a geologically active zone, and evidence of earthquake damage and altered drainage patterns at certain Harappan sites suggests that the landscape itself was shifting in ways that would have disrupted both agriculture and the river routes on which the trade network depended. And then there is the question of disease. A civilization with dense urban populations, shared water infrastructure, and extensive trade connections is, by definition, vulnerable to epidemic illness in ways that dispersed agricultural communities are not. The evidence for epidemic disease in the Harappan collapse is indirect and contested, but it has not been ruled out. What makes the Harappan case particularly strange is the combination of the collapse's thoroughness and its apparent gentleness. This was not a violent end, by most measures. It was a dissolution, a long, slow process of urban contraction and network simplification that left the population alive but dispersed, the cities emptied but not destroyed, the material culture transformed but not erased. The people did not disappear. The civilization did. The script is the thing that haunts this story most persistently. Hundreds of examples, consistent enough to be clearly systematic. Found on seals that were used in trade, pressed into clay, marking ownership or origin or meaning across a network that stretched from Afghanistan to Arabia. Someone designed that script. Someone taught it. Someone used it every day to communicate something that mattered enough to be recorded. What they wrote and what they knew and what they thought about the world they were watching change around them. We cannot read a single word of it. The seals are in museums. The signs are visible and clear. The meaning is completely, stubbornly silent. The Harappan script sits in museum cases around the world, visible, consistent, systematic, and completely unread. It is perhaps the most eloquent silence in this entire exploration. A civilization that clearly had things to say, that developed a system specifically for saying them, and whose words have not reached us across 4,000 years of intervening time. There is something in that particular frustration, the legible illegibility of a lost script, that is different from the other silences we have encountered. The abandoned cities, the emptied capitals, the interrupted archives. Those are absences. The Harappan seals are a presence. They are communicating. We simply cannot hear them. We carry that unresolved frequency with us now as we move once again to the Americas. Back to South America. But this time not to the narrow coastal desert of the Moche, with its river valleys and Pacific fog, but inland and upward, into the high Andean plateau, where the air is thin and the landscape operates on a scale that recalibrates the human sense of proportion. The Andes are not a single mountain range. They are a system, multiple parallel ranges enclosing high basins and valleys at elevations where most of the world's agricultural traditions simply do not function. Altitude, cold, thin air, unpredictable frost. These are the conditions that Andean civilizations learned, over millennia, to work within and around. The solutions they developed, freeze-dried food, raised field agriculture, vertical ecological zonation that spread agricultural risk across multiple altitude bands simultaneously, represent some of the most sophisticated environmental adaptations in human history. The Wari built their empire on top of that accumulated knowledge, and for 5 centuries, it worked. Wari, the capital city of the Wari Empire, located in the Ayacucho Valley of present-day Peru at an elevation of roughly 2,800 meters, was, at its height between approximately 600 and 1000 AD, one of the largest cities in the Americas. Estimates of its population vary, but figures between 10,000 and 70,000 have been proposed, depending on how the urban boundaries are defined and which period of occupation is being measured. The site covers at least 15 square kilometers of terraced hillside, with monumental architecture, enclosed compounds of evident administrative function, and evidence of specialized craft production, fine textiles, ceramics, and metalwork, on a scale that implies both a wealthy elite and an organized system for extracting and distributing surplus. The Wari did not merely inhabit the Andes, they administered them. At its maximum extent, the Wari Empire covered a territory stretching roughly 1,500 kilometers along the Andean spine, from the Cajamarca region in the north to the Arequipa area in the south, and extending in places to the Pacific coast. Across this territory, the Wari established provincial centers, planned cities built to a recognizable architectural template with standardized compound layouts that reflect the imposition of a consistent administrative logic on diverse local landscapes. Roads connected the centers to the capital. Storage facilities built at regular intervals along the routes held the agricultural surplus that fed the administrative apparatus and, in times of shortage, the populations it governed. This is, in structure if not in name, an imperial system. It predates the Inca Empire by roughly 4 centuries, and the Inca would later adopt, consciously or convergently, many of the same administrative tools. The road network, the storage system, the vertical ecological strategy, the provincial center model. Whether the Inca were deliberately inheriting from the Wari tradition or independently arriving at similar solutions to the same geographic problems is one of the genuinely interesting questions in Andean archaeology. What is not genuinely interesting to debate is whether the Wari Empire collapsed. It did, sometime between 900 and 1100 AD. The dating is imprecise because the Wari, like the Harappans, left no deciphered written language. The imperial system fragmented. The provincial centers were abandoned or reduced. The capital at Wari contracted dramatically. The long-distance administrative network dissolved. The political unity that had for 5 centuries imposed a recognizable order on an enormous swath of the Andes simply ceased to function. The conventional explanations begin, as they so often do in this exploration, with climate. The period corresponding to the Wari collapse shows evidence of a prolonged and severe drought across the south-central Andes. A dry period that paleoclimate proxies, including ice cores from the Quelcaya ice cap in southern Peru, record with unusual clarity and consistency. The Quelcaya record is one of the most detailed climate archives available for this region and period, and what it shows is unambiguous: a multi-decade drought of exceptional severity beginning around 900 AD, precisely when the Wari system begins to show signs of stress. For an empire whose administrative logic depended on agricultural surplus, on the ability to produce enough food to feed not just the farming population, but the administrators, the craft specialists, the soldiers, and the laborers who built and maintained the infrastructure, a sustained collapse in agricultural productivity would have been, in the most direct sense, an existential threat. The storage system that was the empire's buffer against normal variability could absorb a bad year or two. It could not absorb a decade or more of significantly reduced harvests across the entire highland zone. But drought, compelling as it is, does not explain everything. Archaeological evidence from several Wari sites suggests internal stress that predates or operates independently of the climatic record. Elite compounds at Wari show evidence of deliberate destruction, not the destruction of conquest, but something that looks more like the systematic dismantling of symbols of authority. Carved stone monuments broken, administrative facilities sealed or burned. The kind of physical erasure that speaks not of an outside enemy, but of an inside reckoning. A population settling accounts with the system that had governed it. Some researchers have interpreted this as evidence of internal revolt. A subject population that had been extracting surplus and providing labor for 5 centuries, finally withdrawing its cooperation from a center that could no longer, in a time of drought and scarcity, make good on the implicit promises that imperial systems depend on. You give us your surplus and your labor. We give you order, security, and food when the harvest fails. When the drought made that bargain impossible to honor, the political legitimacy that sustained it may have evaporated faster than the rainfall. The fringe interpretations in Wari scholarship tend to focus on the question of ritual and cosmological crisis. The idea that Andean political authority was so deeply embedded in religious legitimacy, in the ruler's claimed ability to mediate between the human world and the forces governing rainfall, fertility, and cosmic order, that a prolonged drought was not merely an agricultural problem, but a theological catastrophe. If the sky stops cooperating with the king's prayers, the king has lost something more fundamental than a harvest. Whether Wari political authority operated on exactly those terms is not fully established. But the parallel with what we saw at Mohenjo-Daro, an administrative system of great sophistication that apparently lacked the visible apparatus of divine kingship, and whose legitimacy therefore rested on something harder to identify and perhaps harder to sustain, is worth holding in mind. The site of Wari today is partially excavated and partially built over by the expansion of the modern city of Ayacucho. What has been uncovered is substantial and significant, including, in 2013, the discovery of an unlooted royal tomb containing the remains of elite individuals buried with extraordinary wealth, sacrificed attendants, and evidence of ritual practices that open new questions about Wari religious life faster than they answered old ones. The tomb was sealed for 1,000 years. What it contained had been waiting, in the dark, for someone to find it. What else is waiting beneath the Ayacucho Valley? What other sealed rooms? What other buried evidence of how this empire understood itself and why it ended? The excavations have not yet determined. The ice cores from Cahokia record the drought that may have broken the Wari world in bands of compressed snow and dust, laid down year by year in the cold above the clouds. The empire's own account of what happened is still missing. The Wari Empire left a sealed tomb that waited 1,000 years to be opened, and what it contained generated more questions than it resolved. That is, by now, a pattern we recognize. The deeper archaeology reaches into these lost worlds, the more it finds not conclusions but invitations to keep looking. There is something fitting about that, about the idea that the past is not a fixed thing, not a settled record waiting to be read, but a living problem that changes shape as we approach it. Every sealed room, every unread script, every capital city still unlocated beneath its desert or its floodplain. They are not failures of investigation. They are reminders that the world that came before us was as large and complicated as our own, and that we have barely begun to understand it. We move now from the high Andean plateau, with its ice cores and its drought records and its dismantled symbols of authority, and we travel northeast, across the Pacific, across Asia, and into one of the oldest and most storied deserts on Earth, to a landscape that appears, from above, to be nothing but emptiness, a vast, flat, sand-colored expanse stretching to every horizon without apparent feature or variation. But the Rub al-Khali, the empty quarter of the Arabian Peninsula, is not empty in the way that description implies. It is the largest continuous sand desert in the world, covering roughly a quarter of the Arabian Peninsula across parts of present-day Saudi Arabia, Oman, Yemen, and the United Arab Emirates. Its dunes reach heights of 250 meters. Its summer temperatures exceed 60 degrees Celsius at the surface. It receives almost no rainfall. Modern crossing of it required the most serious desert expedition equipment ever assembled when Wilfred Thesiger traversed it in the late 1940s. And somewhere beneath its sands, there may be, almost certainly is, a city. The story of Ubar begins not with archaeology, but with legend, which is itself significant. Across the Arabian Peninsula, in the oral traditions of Bedouin peoples who have navigated the desert for millennia, the name of a great city recurs. A city of extraordinary wealth, of towering columns, of a people so prosperous and so arrogant that their destruction became, in the Islamic tradition, one of history's defining moral lessons. The Quran refers to it directly in Surah Al-Fajr as Iram of the Pillars, a city of a kind not built in all the land, whose people transgressed all bounds and were destroyed by God. The story is explicit about the nature of the destruction. Not conquest, not abandonment, not the slow erosion of climate and politics. A sudden, total, divine annihilation, the city swallowed, according to the tradition, by the earth itself. For most of the modern era, scholars treated Ubar as they treated Atlantis, as myth, as moral fable, as the kind of story that serves a narrative purpose without necessarily corresponding to a physical reality. The desert was too vast, the sources too literary, the whole thing too convenient as a cautionary tale to be taken seriously as geography. And then, in 1992, a team led by filmmaker and explorer Nicholas Clapp, working with satellite imagery from NASA's space shuttle and the assistance of archaeologist Juris Zarins, announced that they had found it. The satellite imagery had revealed something invisible from the ground. Ancient caravan tracks converging from multiple directions across the desert surface toward a single point in the Dhofar region of present-day Oman, near a place called Shisar. From the ground, Shisar appeared to be a minor site. From space, it sat at the intersection of routes that must have been among the most heavily traveled roads in the ancient incense trade. The network that moved frankincense and myrrh from the productive trees of southern Arabia northward toward the Mediterranean and Mesopotamian markets that consumed them in extraordinary quantities. Excavation at Shisar revealed the remains of a substantial fortified settlement. Towers, walls, a central structure of clear administrative or ceremonial significance. The site dated to a period stretching from roughly 3000 BC to approximately 300 AD, with the most intensive occupation corresponding to the height of the frankincense trade. This was, by every material measure, exactly the kind of place that the Ubar legends described. A wealthy, strategically positioned city growing rich on the trade of one of the ancient world's most valuable commodities. And the manner of its ending was, if anything, more remarkable than its existence. The site at Shisar is built on top of a massive underground limestone cavern. Over centuries of occupation, the weight of the city above and the gradual dissolution of the limestone below created a situation of increasing geological instability. At some point, and the dating suggests this occurred sometime around the 3rd or 4th century AD, the cavern collapsed. The ground beneath a substantial portion of the settlement simply gave way, dropping structures, walls, and towers into the void below. The physical evidence of this collapse is visible in the excavated site today. Walls that were standing and intact descend at impossible angles into the depression created by the subsidence. The destruction was sudden enough that the archaeology shows no evidence of the kind of gradual abandonment we have seen at so many of the other sites in this journey. This was not a place that people left over generations. This was a place where, on some particular day or night, the ground opened. The convergence between the physical evidence and the legendary account is striking enough that many researchers who would normally be cautious about connecting archaeology to religious tradition have acknowledged it directly. The Quran describes Aram as destroyed by a punishment that came from below, that the city was, in some sense, swallowed. The geological record at Shisar describes exactly that mechanism. Whether the ancient witnesses to the collapse interpreted what they saw through a theological framework that then entered the oral tradition, or whether the Quranic account preserves a memory of an actual event transmitted across centuries, the physical reality of a city swallowed by its own ground is not in dispute. What is in dispute is the scope of the identification. Not all archaeologists are convinced that Shisar is Ubar, or that Ubar and Iram are the same place. The site is significant and the discovery is genuine, but the equation of a specific archaeological site with a specific legendary city involves a leap that the evidence supports suggestively rather than definitively. The frankincense trade that made Shisar wealthy operated across multiple hubs and staging posts. Ubar, if it existed as the legends describe, may have been larger, or differently located, or may have encompassed a network of related sites rather than a single city. The desert has not finished yielding its information. The Rub al-Khali remains, by any practical measure, one of the least archaeologically surveyed regions on Earth. The caravan routes visible in the satellite imagery connect not just to Shisar, but to other points across the empty quarter that have never been systematically investigated. The incense trade, which sustained the economies of southern Arabia for at least 2,000 years, generated settlements and infrastructure across a landscape that modern archaeology has barely touched. If Ubar was real, and the evidence suggests that something real underlies the legend, it may have been larger and more complex than the site at Shisar alone can account for. The towers that the Quran describes as unmatched anywhere in the land. If they were built from the same limestone that underlies the Dhofar region, they may still be there, somewhere below the sand, preserved in the same geological formation that eventually destroyed them. A city that the ancient world remembered as the greatest it had ever seen, destroyed in a single moment by the ground opening beneath it, and located, after millennia of searching, only to raise the possibility that what we found may be only part of what was lost. The empty quarter keeps its distances. The dunes move. The old caravan tracks, visible from space, lead toward answers that the desert has not yet decided to give up. The empty quarter keeps its distances. Ubar, or what we believe may be Ubar, was found not by walking the desert, but by looking at it from space, by tracing the ghost of ancient roads visible only from an altitude that its builders could never have imagined. There is something quietly extraordinary about that, about a city that hid for 2,000 years and was finally located not by excavation, but by the convergence of caravan routes on a satellite photograph. The desert, it turns out, remembers paths even when it forgets everything else. We stay in the desert now, but we move northwest, out of the empty quarter, and into a different kind of arid landscape. Harder, rockier, more varied in its topography. A landscape of sandstone cliffs and narrow canyons, and sudden heart-stopping vistas where the rock has been carved by wind and water into formations that look deliberate, architectural, almost intentional. The Negev and the Hejaz, the land bridge between Arabia and the Mediterranean world. A region that, for most of recorded history, has been understood as a transit zone, a place you pass through on the way to somewhere else. The Nabataeans understood it differently. They understood it as the place itself, as home, as the foundation of an empire built not on fertile land or navigable rivers, but on the precise, almost miraculous management of water in a landscape where water was the rarest thing in the world. Stand at Petra and let the city come to you slowly, because that is the only way Petra can be approached honestly. The Siki, the narrow canyon entrance, is deliberate architecture as much as natural geology. It compresses the visitor, removes the sky, and then releases everything at once when the treasury appears at the far end. Rose-red sandstone carved directly into the cliff face, 2 stories of columns and pediments and decorative detail emerging from raw rock as though the rock itself had decided to become a building. It is one of the most dramatic architectural moments in the world, and the Nabataeans knew exactly what they were doing when they positioned it there. But Petra is only the most visible part of the Nabataean world, the part that tourists see, that photographs capture, that the imagination seizes on. The part that is, in the context of this story, almost a distraction, because the deepest mystery of the Nabataeans is not at Petra. It is in the desert to the south and east, in the Negev highlands and the Hejaz, where between roughly 100 BC and 700 AD, the Nabataeans built something that should not have been possible in a landscape that receives less than 100 millimeters of rainfall annually. They built farms, not small subsistence plots, large-scale agricultural systems covering substantial areas of the most arid terrain in the region, terraced fields, runoff collection systems of extraordinary sophistication, farm complexes with wine presses and storage facilities in residential buildings, producing wheat, grapes, and olives in sufficient quantities, not merely to feed a local population, but to generate surplus for trade. The engineering behind this achievement is, on close examination, remarkable. The Nabataeans developed a system for harvesting every drop of rainfall that fell on the rocky hillsides surrounding their fields, clearing the natural vegetation from catchment areas to increase runoff, channeling that runoff through precisely graded conduits into farm terraces designed to hold and slowly release moisture into the soil, and constructing cisterns capable of storing the water from a single rain event for months of subsequent use. They were not fighting the desert. They were reading it with a precision that modern hydrologists have studied seriously and found genuinely impressive. At its height, the Nabataean agricultural system in the central Negev highlands alone supported an estimated population of tens of thousands of people, a density that the modern landscape, without artificial irrigation, could not begin to sustain. And then it was abandoned. The timing of the abandonment varies by site and by the criteria used to define it, but the broad picture shows a dramatic decline in Nabataean agricultural settlement in the desert regions beginning sometime in the 7th century AD, and essentially complete by the 9th or 10th century. The farm complexes were left. The terraces were not maintained. The runoff channels silted up or were broken by the erosion that their maintenance had previously prevented. The cisterns emptied and were not cleaned. The conventional explanation points first to the Islamic conquest of the region in the 7th century AD. The Arab expansion disrupted the existing political and economic order across the entire Middle East and North Africa, including the trade networks that had sustained the Nabataean commercial system for centuries. Petra had already been absorbed into the Roman Empire in 106 AD, but the broader Nabataean cultural and agricultural tradition had continued under Roman and then Byzantine administration. The Islamic conquest represented a more fundamental disruption, a change not just of political overlord, but of the entire regional economic system within which the Nabataean settlements operated. But the political explanation is, as it so often is in this exploration, insufficient on its own. The Nabataean agricultural system was not dependent on trade in the way that, say, the Harappan network or the Chinese treasure fleet were dependent on commerce. It was a subsistence and surplus system built on local rainfall and local labor. Political upheaval does not automatically disable a farming system that has been functioning for centuries. People do not abandon productive farmland simply because the government changes. Something else was happening. Climate data for the region suggests a drying trend beginning in the Byzantine period, a gradual reduction in the already minimal rainfall that the Nabataean system depended on to function. The runoff agriculture that the Nabataeans had perfected operated within a specific range of precipitation. Too little rain and the catchment areas do not generate enough runoff to fill the terraces adequately. The system is elegant precisely because it multiplies the effect of rainfall across large collection areas, but that multiplication requires a baseline of actual precipitation to amplify. Reduce the baseline enough, and the system produces diminishing returns regardless of how well it is maintained. Some researchers have proposed that a combination of climatic drying and political disruption created a compound crisis, that the agricultural system, already under stress from reduced rainfall, lost the organized maintenance it required at precisely the moment when the political changes of the 7th century disrupted the administrative and social structures that had previously provided that maintenance. A system that required continuous coordinated labor to function could not survive the simultaneous loss of both its climatic margin and its organizational foundation. There are also more speculative interpretations that circulate at the edges of the scholarship. Some researchers have noted that the abandonment of the Nabataean desert settlements coincides, roughly, with the emergence of new Islamic agricultural settlements in better watered regions, suggesting that the population did not disappear but relocated, drawn toward the economic and social opportunities of the new order in places where farming did not require the extraordinary effort that the desert demanded. The Nabataean achievement was, in this reading, abandoned not because it failed, but because it was no longer necessary, because easier alternatives had become available. Whether that represents a reasonable adaptation or a catastrophic loss of accumulated knowledge is a question that the landscape itself seems to pose. The terraces are still there. Many of them are structurally intact after more than 1,000 years of abandonment. Experimental agricultural projects in the modern Negev have demonstrated that the Nabataean runoff system can be reactivated, that fields abandoned for over a millennium can, with the restoration of the ancient infrastructure, produce crops again, using nothing but rainfall. The knowledge was not lost. It was encoded in the stones. What caused the people who built those stones to walk away from them, whether by force, by choice, by climatic necessity, or by some combination of all three, remains a question that the terraced hillsides of the Negev have been sitting with, in patient silence, for a very long time. The Nabataean terraces encode 1,000 years of accumulated knowledge in stone and gradient and carefully placed channel walls. They are still there. They still work. The people who built them left, and the knowledge stayed behind, waiting in the landscape for someone to read it again. That image, of knowledge outlasting the civilization that generated it, surviving not in texts or traditions but in the physical shape of the land itself, is one we carry with us as we move now. North and west, dramatically north and west, leaving the sun-scorched desert of the Negev behind and traveling toward a coast so different in character that it seems to belong to a different planet entirely. We are going to the edge of the known world, or rather to what was the edge of the known world, for a specific group of people at a specific moment in history, before they sailed past it and found something that changed the map of human geography in ways they could not have fully comprehended, and that they, for reasons we still do not entirely understand, chose not to pursue. The North Atlantic in October is not a welcoming place. The water is the color of pewter and moves with the weight of something ancient and indifferent. The wind comes off the Labrador Sea carrying cold that is not merely physical. It is the cold of distance, of the vast, empty ocean stretching eastward toward Iceland and Norway, westward toward nothing that any European in the year 1000 AD knew existed. The coast of northern Newfoundland is low and boggy, cut by inlets, fringed with black spruce and lichen-covered rock. The sky is large and frequently unkind. It is here at a place called Lanceau Meadows, a corruption, most likely, of the French Lanceau Meadows, the Bay of Jellyfish, that the most consequential short-term settlement in the history of human exploration was established, occupied briefly, and then abandoned without explanation nearly 5 centuries before Columbus crossed the Atlantic. The site was discovered in 1960 by the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his archaeologist wife Anne Steine Ingstad, acting on a hunch derived from the Norse sagas and the knowledge that the Greenlandic Norse had spoken of lands to the west. What they found, working with local fisherman George Decker, who pointed them toward the unusual mounds in the bog, was not immediately dramatic. A series of low grass-covered ridges near the beach, unremarkable to any eye not trained to recognize what they represented. Excavation revealed them as the remains of 8 Norse buildings, longhouses, workshops, a smithy, constructed in the Norse style using sod over a wooden framework, dating with remarkable consistency to around 1000 AD. The artifacts recovered confirmed the identification beyond reasonable doubt. A bronze ring-headed pin of a type worn by Norse men and women, a stone lamp of Norse design, iron boat rivets, a spindle whorl indicating the presence of women. Most significantly, the smithy contained iron slag and a worked iron bloom, evidence of iron smelting that represented a technological capability entirely absent from the indigenous peoples of the region at that time. This was a Norse settlement on the North American continent, established half a millennium before European contact is supposed to have begun. It is the only confirmed Norse site in North America outside Greenland, and its discovery, confirmed and designated a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978, rewrote the timeline of the human story in the Western Hemisphere. But the confirmation of the site's existence only deepened the central mystery. Lanceau Meadows was occupied for a remarkably short period. The best current estimates, based on radiocarbon dating and the depth of artifact accumulation, suggest an occupation of perhaps 10 years, possibly less. Some researchers think the site may have been used intermittently rather than continuously, serving as a base for more extensive exploration to the south and west, rather than as a permanent settlement. The sagas speak of a land called Vinland, a place where wild grapes grew, suggesting a location considerably further south than Newfoundland, where grapes do not grow. Lanceau Meadows may have been the gateway to Vinland, rather than Vinland itself. The Norse sagas, primarily the saga of the Greenlanders and the saga of Eric the Red, describe multiple voyages to the lands west of Greenland, with varying degrees of detail and consistency. They are literary texts, written down in Iceland centuries after the events they describe, and they require careful handling as historical sources. But they agree on certain things. The voyages happened. Contact was made with the indigenous people of the region, called Skraelings in the sagas, a term whose precise meaning is debated, but which was used by the Norse to describe the peoples of North America and the Arctic. And the attempts at settlement failed. The saga accounts of why they failed are consistent in their broad outline and fascinating in their implications. The relationship with the Skraelings began with cautious trading and deteriorated into violence. The Norse were, in the saga accounts, outnumbered. Dramatically, perhaps overwhelmingly outnumbered. The decision to abandon the settlement is presented in both sagas as a practical military assessment. There were too many indigenous people and too few Norse for a permanent presence to be sustainable against determined resistance. This explanation has the virtue of being entirely plausible. The Norse who reached Newfoundland numbered at most in the dozens, perhaps 60 to 90 individuals based on the scale of the structures at Lonso Meadows. The indigenous populations of northeastern North America, while not densely settled by later standards, would have represented a vastly larger human presence across the landscape. The Norse could build a forge and a longhouse. They could not, with the numbers they had available, establish the kind of territorial presence that would have been necessary for a permanent colony. But the saga explanation, plausible as it is, does not resolve everything. Why didn't they come back in larger numbers? The Norse had colonized Iceland and Greenland, both of which presented significant challenges, through persistent, incremental effort over generations. The timber resources of North America alone would have been an extraordinary incentive for peoples from the nearly treeless landscapes of Iceland and Greenland, where wood was so scarce that it was collected as driftage. The saga's record that Leif Erikson's expedition brought timber back to Greenland. The value of the resource was understood. Some researchers have proposed that the deteriorating climate of the North Atlantic in the centuries following the initial voyages, the onset of the conditions that would eventually contribute to the abandonment of the Norse western settlement in Greenland, reduced the capacity of the Greenlandic Norse to mount the kind of sustained colonization effort that North America would have required. A society under environmental stress at home has limited surplus for expensive overseas ventures. Others have suggested that the specific geography of Lonso Meadows, its exposure, its distance from Greenland, its position on a coast that offered few natural harbors suitable for the Norse ships, made it a logistically difficult base that required more support than the Greenlandic settlements could provide. And there are those who have noted carefully that the Norse relationship with the Skraelings was not uniformly hostile. The sagas describe trading as well as fighting. Some researchers have speculated about the possibility of more extended contact, of Norse individuals or small groups remaining in North America, integrating into indigenous communities, disappearing into a history that neither the sagas nor the archaeological record have yet captured. The site at Lonso Meadows was carefully abandoned. The Norse did not leave in panic. The buildings were emptied deliberately, useful materials removed, the structures left standing rather than burned. It was the departure of people who intended, perhaps, to return, or who at least saw no reason to destroy what they had built. They sailed east, the longhouses slowly filled with bog. Whether anyone ever came back and what they found if they did, the Newfoundland coast is not saying. The longhouses at Lonso Meadows were emptied deliberately, their useful contents removed, the structures left standing in the bog as though the people who built them had not yet decided whether they were leaving for good. That careful, considered departure, neither panic nor permanence, is one of the quieter puzzles of the Norse presence in North America. They came, they built, they left. And the question of what they intended and what they found extends outward from that Newfoundland headland into a much larger and much murkier body of speculation. Because Lonso Meadows is the only confirmed Norse site in North America. Confirmed is the operative word. And confirmation, in archaeology, requires physical evidence of a kind that survives. Iron slag, datable organic material, artifacts whose cultural origin is unambiguous. The absence of confirmation is not the same as the absence of contact. It is simply the absence of surviving proof. That distinction, between what can be proven and what may nonetheless have happened, is the space in which our next story lives. It is a story that serious historians treat with considerable caution, and that enthusiasts have periodically stretched beyond what the evidence will support. The truth, as is so often the case, sits somewhere in the difficult middle ground, neither confirmed nor dismissible, neither history nor pure legend. This is the story of Prince Madoc of Wales, and the question of whether a Welsh prince reached the Americas 3 centuries before Columbus, disappeared into the interior of a continent, and left traces so faint and so contested that they have generated argument for 500 years without resolution. Wales, 1170 AD. The kingdom of Gwynedd is fracturing. Owain Gwynedd, one of the most powerful Welsh kings of the medieval period, has died, and his sons are doing what medieval sons so frequently did in the aftermath of a powerful father's death. They are fighting each other for the inheritance, with the particular ferocity that comes from knowing that there will be only one survivor worth speaking of. Into this atmosphere of dynastic violence, the legend places a figure named Madoc ab Owain Gwynedd, one of Owain's many sons, legitimate or otherwise depending on which source you consult, who reportedly looked at the carnage of the succession struggle, concluded that Wales held nothing for him, gathered a small fleet, and sailed west into the Atlantic. The legend, in its earliest surviving written forms, claims that Madoc reached a land beyond the ocean, fertile, temperate, unknown, and returned to Wales to report what he had found. Then, according to the tradition, he gathered a larger group of settlers, perhaps several hundred people in 10 ships, and sailed west again. He was never heard from again. The first question any historian asks of this story is, what are the sources, and when were they written? The answer is not encouraging for those who want a straightforward historical narrative. The earliest clear written references to Madoc date from the late 16th century, more than 400 years after the alleged voyage. The Welsh poet Gwytyn Owain, writing in the late 15th century, has been cited as an early source, but the relevant attribution is contested. The story gained its widest circulation during the Elizabethan period, when it was enthusiastically promoted by the Welsh scholar Humphrey Llwyd and later by John Dee, who used it, pointedly, as an argument for English territorial claims in the Americas against Spanish dominance. The political utility of the Madoc story at that particular moment should make any careful reader pause. A Welsh prince reaching America before Columbus would, in the legal and diplomatic framework of the 16th century, provide a basis for British claims to North American territory that predated the Spanish. Dee, in particular, was constructing arguments for a British empire, and Madoc was a useful tool. Whether the story was invented for that purpose, embellished from a genuine but modest tradition, or represents authentic historical memory, that is the question no one has satisfactorily answered. What gave the legend its most persistent and interesting afterlife was not the documentary record, but the reports that began accumulating from the interior of North America as European and American explorers moved westward through the 18th and 19th centuries. The reports followed a consistent pattern. Explorers and traders encountered Native American peoples, most frequently associated with the Mandan people of the upper Missouri River, who seemed to European eyes anomalous in ways that invited explanation. The Mandan built semi-permanent villages of a distinctive architectural style. They practiced agriculture. Their boats, bull boats made from buffalo hide stretched over a willow frame, bore a striking visual resemblance to the Welsh coracle. Some observers reported that Mandan individuals had lighter skin, gray or blue eyes, or other physical characteristics that seemed, to those observers, inconsistent with their assumptions about indigenous North American appearance. And, most provocatively, some explorers claimed that the Mandan language contained words that resembled Welsh. The Welsh-speaking explorer John Evans traveled to the Mandan villages in 1796 specifically to investigate the claims. He spent the winter there, learned the language, and returned with a categorical conclusion. There was no Welsh in the Mandan language. None. The linguistic evidence that others had claimed to find was, in his assessment, a product of wishful pattern matching rather than genuine linguistic relationship. Evans was thorough and apparently honest. His conclusion should have settled the linguistic question, and for most professional linguists, it has. The Mandan language has been studied carefully, and it belongs unambiguously to the Siouan language family. There is no Welsh in it, but the broader question, of whether any pre-Columbian contact between Wales and North America occurred, leaving traces other than linguistic, has proven harder to close definitively. The physical evidence cited by Madoc enthusiasts over the centuries has been various and consistently inconclusive. Stone structures in the American South and Midwest have been identified as Welsh forts. Inscriptions on rocks in West Virginia and elsewhere have been interpreted as Colbran, an archaic Welsh script. Burial mounds have been proposed as Welsh in origin. Each piece of evidence has been examined by archaeologists and found to have a more parsimonious explanation. Indigenous construction, natural geological formations, colonial-era carvings, or outright fabrication. The most famous physical claim, the Dogtooth Bend stone inscription in Kentucky, which 19th-century Welsh enthusiasts promoted as definitive proof of Madoc's presence, was eventually identified as a forgery. And yet the story does not die. It is kept alive not by credulous people ignoring evidence, but by something more fundamental. By the genuine uncertainty about what happened in the North Atlantic and North America in the centuries between the Norse presence and Columbus. L'Anse aux Meadows proves that Europeans reached North America before Columbus. It does not prove that they stopped at Newfoundland. The ocean was crossable. The question of who crossed it, and how often, and what traces they left, is not fully answered by the evidence currently available. The Mandan people themselves, whose culture was so frequently invoked in the Madoc discussion, were devastated by smallpox epidemics in the 18th and 19th centuries, losing the vast majority of their population, and with it an enormous portion of their cultural and historical knowledge. Whatever they knew about their own origins, their own history, their own long memory of the land they had occupied, much of it is gone, lost in a demographic catastrophe that had nothing to do with any Welsh prince and everything to do with European contact of a very different and very documented kind. What the Mandan remembered and what they might have been able to say about the deep history of the Upper Missouri will never now be fully known. Madoc, if he existed, sailed into a continent that already held millions of people and thousands of years of history. Whether he arrived, and where, and what became of him and his settlers, the interior of North America absorbed whatever answer there is. It has not yet given it back. The interior of North America absorbed whatever answer Madoc's story holds and has not given it back. That is, in its way, an honest conclusion. Not a failure of investigation, but a recognition that some questions live at the boundary between history and the unknowable, and that the boundary itself is worth examining carefully. What we take from the Madoc story, stripped of the political motivations that shaped its telling and the wishful thinking that has periodically distorted its interpretation, is something more interesting than a simple yes or no. It is the reminder that the ocean was crossable long before we have proof of crossing. That absence of evidence, in a world where most things leave no trace at all, is a statement about the limits of survival rather than the limits of human movement. We carry that thought with us now as we move south, far south, from the gray Atlantic and the upper Missouri River to the eastern slopes of the Andes, where the mountains release their moisture into one of the most biologically dense and geographically impenetrable environments on the surface of the earth. From a story about a prince who may have sailed into a continent and vanished, to a story about a city that may have received the wealth of a collapsing empire and hidden it so completely that 5 centuries of searching have produced nothing definitive. From one possible vanishing into another. Stand at the edge of the cloud forest on the eastern Andean escarpment, somewhere in the vast transitional zone where Peru, Bolivia, and Brazil converge, and try to understand what you are looking at. The terrain descends in front of you not gradually but precipitously, the Andes dropping thousands of meters over a horizontal distance that looks manageable on a map and is murderous on foot. The forest begins almost immediately and thickens as the altitude falls. Cloud forest giving way to lowland rainforest, the canopy closing overhead, the ground becoming a tangle of root and mud and standing water. Rivers appear and disappear. Paths that seem clear for 100 meters dissolve into vegetation. The air is warm and wet and full of sound. This is the western edge of Amazonia. And somewhere in it, if the legends, the oral traditions, the Jesuit reports, and the dying confessions of Inca nobles are to be given any weight. There is a city, Paititi, the last refuge. The place to which the Inca, or at least the remnant of the Inca who refused to submit to the Spanish conquest, retreated with their gold, their sacred objects, their priests, and their knowledge, and where they built or occupied a settlement so deep in the forest that no Spanish expedition ever reached it, and no modern expedition has confirmed its location. The historical context that gives Paititi its plausibility begins with the conquest itself. When Francisco Pizarro and his small force of conquistadors captured and executed the Inca Emperor Atahualpa in 1533, they did not end the Inca state in a single blow. A rump Inca resistance, the Neo-Inca state, based first at Vitkos and then at Vilcabamba, persisted in the Andean forests for nearly 40 years, maintaining a functioning Inca court, performing traditional ceremonies, and periodically raiding Spanish settlements in the surrounding lowlands. Vilcabamba fell in 1572. The last Inca emperor, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed in Cusco. The Spanish believed at that point that the Inca resistance was finished. But the question of what happened to the accumulated wealth of the Inca Empire, the gold, the silver, the sacred objects of the sun cult, the contents of the royal storehouses that had not been captured, was never satisfactorily answered. The Spanish received the famous ransom of Atahualpa, a room filled once with gold and twice with silver. They looted the temples of Cusco. They melted and shipped enormous quantities of precious metal to Spain. And still, by the accounts of the Spanish themselves, they believed there was more. Much more. The Inca Empire had been accumulating gold for centuries. What they captured represented, in the assessments of the conquistadors' own chroniclers, only a fraction of what must have existed. Where did the rest go? The Paititi legend crystallizes the answer that circulated among the Spanish colonial population, and that appears in documents from the 16th and 17th centuries with enough consistency to resist easy dismissal. The Inca in this account moved their most sacred and valuable holdings eastward, into the forest, beyond the mountains, to a place the Spanish could not follow. Jesuit missionaries operating in the Bolivian and Peruvian lowlands in the 17th century recorded, from indigenous informants, accounts of a great city in the forest, a settlement of stone buildings, of people who wore fine textiles, of a place associated with gold. The reports came from different regions and different informants and described, with variations, something consistent enough to constitute a pattern. Father Andres Lopez, a Jesuit writing in 1600, described receiving information about a large city called Paititi from indigenous people on the Madre de Dios River. His account is specific about geography, a location beyond certain rivers in the direction of certain mountains, in ways that have allowed modern researchers to identify search areas, even if the city itself has not been found. The searches that followed across 4 centuries constitute one of the most sustained and costly treasure hunts in the history of exploration. Spanish colonial expeditions probed the forests of eastern Peru and Bolivia repeatedly in the 16th and 17th centuries, following rumors, following informants, following maps drawn from descriptions that turned out to be inaccurate or were deliberately misleading. Several expeditions simply disappeared, consumed by the forest, by disease, by the rivers, by the sheer physical impossibility of sustained movement through lowland Amazonia without the knowledge base that indigenous peoples had developed over millennia. The 20th century brought new waves of searchers. The explorer Colonel Percy Fawcett, who was actually searching for a different city, his own obsession, which he called simply Z, located in the Brazilian interior, disappeared in 1925 with his son and a companion in the Mato Grosso, generating one of the great unsolved mysteries of 20th century exploration. Fawcett's disappearance was distinct from the Paititi search in its geographic focus, but it belongs to the same category of obsession: the conviction that the Amazon concealed something extraordinary, and that the forest's impenetrability was a veil rather than an absence. More recent expeditions have employed satellite imagery, LiDAR technology, and the accumulated geographic knowledge of indigenous communities to search more systematically. The results have been, depending on how you read them, either promising or cautionary. LiDAR surveys across Amazonia have revealed extensive evidence of pre-Columbian earthworks, settlements, and managed landscapes that demonstrate the Amazon was far more densely and sophisticatedly inhabited before the epidemics of European contact than previously understood. The Amazon was not empty. It was full of people, full of settlements, full of managed forest and agricultural infrastructure. But the specific city of Paititi, the Inca refuge, the repository of the empire's last wealth, has not been identified. The earthworks found by LiDAR are real and significant, but they belong to pre-Inca Amazonian cultures rather than to the Inca tradition specifically. The search continues. In 2001, an Italian explorer named Mario Poglia discovered a 1600 document in the Vatican archives describing a large city called Paititi, reported by a Jesuit missionary, with geographic details that researchers found more precise and potentially more useful than earlier accounts. The document had been sitting in the archive, unread in this context, for 400 years. The Vatican archive is large. The Amazonian forest is larger. Somewhere in the relationship between the documented Inca retreat into the forest, the consistent indigenous reports of a city in the lowlands, and the 4 centuries of failed searches, there is an answer. Whether it is the answer the searchers have been looking for, a city of stone and gold waiting to be found, or something quieter and more complicated, the forest has maintained its position with characteristic indifference. It keeps everything. It reveals almost nothing, and the expeditions that did not return have become, themselves, part of the mystery they went to solve.